The night Richard Mercer stood in a ballroom full of Charleston's wealthiest people and called Ethan Walker a nobody. He had no idea he was talking to the man who had quietly saved over 400 children's lives. He had no idea that the grease-stained mechanic standing near the back of the room had spent 5 years donating $22 million to the very foundation Richard had spent those same 5 years slowly destroying. And he definitely had no idea that tonight, in front of every camera, every donor, every person who had ever dismissed Ethan Walker as invisible, the whole rotten truth was about to come apart. Drop a comment with your city. Let's see how far this story travels. The boat wasn't going to fix itself. Ethan Walker knew that the moment he pulled back the engine cover and got his first real look at what he was dealing with, a corroded fuel line, two cracked gaskets, and what appeared to be a bird's nest wedged somewhere it absolutely should not be. He stared at the mess for a long moment, then reached for his wrench. Again with the birds, he muttered to nobody in particular. It was just past 7 in the morning on a Tuesday in late October, and the Charleston waterfront was doing what it always did at this hour, waking up slowly, reluctantly, like a person who'd stayed out too late the night before. The harbor smelled like salt and diesel and something faintly fishy that never quite went away no matter how many times the city cleaned the docks. Ethan had stopped noticing it years ago. He was 32 years old, though most people who met him guessed older, not because he looked worn out exactly, but because there was something settled about him, a stillness in his eyes, a way of moving through the world without unnecessary noise. His hands were the hands of someone who worked with them constantly, calloused across the palms, perpetually stained with grease that soap never fully reached, knuckles that had been split and healed so many times they'd developed their own geography. He wore the same thing he wore almost every day: dark work pants, a faded gray shirt with a small tear near the left shoulder that he kept meaning to fix. Steel-toed boots that were long past their prime, but still had miles left in them. The marina where he worked, Callaway's Boat Repair, a family operation that had been on this exact stretch of waterfront for 30 years, was nothing fancy. A long wooden dock, a corrugated metal workshop with questionable wiring, 3 hydraulic lifts that 2 of them worked reliably, and a hand-painted sign that Frank Callaway had put up himself in 1994 and never once updated. It was the kind of place that survived not because of marketing or location or any particular business strategy, but because Ethan Walker was very, very good at fixing things. He had been working here for 6 years. Before that, he'd done the same kind of work down in Savannah, and before that, briefly, he'd tried something else entirely. A life that looked different from the outside, with a different kind of future attached to it. But that was a long time ago, and Ethan didn't spend much time looking backward. He had more immediate concerns. "Dad!" The voice came from the dock behind him, small, slightly impatient, carrying the particular tone of someone who had already said this exact word at least twice, and was prepared to say it several more times until results were produced. Ethan didn't look up from the engine. "I hear you, Lily. You said we'd leave at 7:15. I know what I said. It's 7:19. He set down the wrench, straightened up, turned around. Lily Walker was 8 years old, and she was standing on the dock with her backpack already on both shoulders and her lunchbox held in front of her with both hands like she was presenting evidence in a court case. She had her mother's eyes, dark brown, almost black, with a directness in them that made adults instinctively want to explain themselves. She was wearing a purple jacket that she'd chosen herself and a pair of sneakers that lit up when she walked, which she still loved despite being, as she had informed Ethan recently, basically 9. "You have grease on your cheek," she said. He reached up and wiped his face with the back of his hand, which, given that his hand was also covered in grease, accomplished nothing visible. Lily watched this with the expression of someone who had learned to manage their expectations. That didn't help. Probably not. He grabbed a rag from his back pocket, did a better job this time, and then picked up his jacket from the dock railing. "Ready. You said that 4 minutes ago. And now I mean it." He put his hand on her shoulder and they started walking toward the parking lot. "How's your project going? The one about South Carolina history?" "I finished it yesterday." "Already?" "It wasn't that hard." She glanced up at him. "I put in extra stuff about the harbor because of your job." "Did you?" Miss Chen said it was very thorough. The way she said it, slightly imitating her teacher's voice, clearly proud of herself but trying not to show it, made Ethan's chest do the thing it sometimes did. The thing that had no name exactly. Something between love and grief and gratitude, all mixed up together in a way that never fully separated out. That's good, Lilybird. Don't call me that at school. I wasn't going to call you that at school. You did last time. That was one time. They reached the truck, a 2009 Ford F-150 with a dent in the passenger door and a check engine light that had been on for so long Ethan had started to think of it as a design feature. He got in, turned the key, and listened to the engine complain for a moment before it settled into something that sounded approximately functional. The drive to Lily's school took 11 minutes on a good day. Today it took 14 because of a fender bender on Morrison Drive that had backed up traffic half a mile. Lily spent the time telling him about something that had happened at lunch the previous day, involving a misunderstanding about whose sandwich was whose, a story that had several characters, a dramatic turning point, and what sounded like a fully satisfying resolution. Ethan listened, really listened. Not the half attention that passed for listening when you were tired or distracted, but actual full presence, watching her face in the rearview mirror as she talked. This was something he had decided, a long time ago, to always do. To be actually there when she was talking to him. It cost him nothing, and it was the most important thing he did. He dropped her off at 7:43. She hopped out, adjusted her backpack straps, and walked toward the entrance without looking back. Which was normal now, had been normal for about a year, this new independence she was building piece by piece. But then, just before she reached the door, she turned and found him still watching. She gave him a small wave. Just one. He waved back. Then she was inside, and he was alone in the truck, and he sat there for a few seconds longer than he needed to before pulling back out onto the street. The rest of the morning was ordinary in the specific way that Ethan's mornings usually were, which is to say, filled with small problems that required complete attention and left no room for anything else. By 9 o'clock, he had diagnosed the corrosion issue on the Peterson boat and ordered the replacement parts, argued gently with the supplier about a delivery timeline that was 3 weeks out when it should have been 1, and consumed approximately 40% of a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. Frank Calloway came in around 9:30, the way he always did, unhurried, with a paper bag from the bakery down the street, and the easy manner of a man who had reached an age where he'd stopped apologizing for his pace. Frank was 64, thick through the shoulders from decades of physical work, with white hair he kept cut close and a hearing aid in his left ear that he claimed was unnecessary and that everyone else at the marina could confirm was very much necessary. "Peterson boat?" Frank said, setting the paper bag on the workbench. "Fuel line and gaskets. Parts coming Thursday if the supplier comes through." "They won't." "Probably not." Frank looked at the boat, then at Ethan, with the particular expression that meant he was about to say something he'd been sitting on for a while. Ethan had learned to recognize this look over 6 years. "You look tired," Frank said. "I'm fine." "I didn't say you weren't fine. I said you look tired." Ethan wiped his hands on a clean rag and didn't answer right away. There was a distinction Frank was drawing there, and they both understood it. "Long night," Ethan said finally. "Lily okay?" "She's great. It was something else. Some paperwork I was looking at." Frank made a sound that wasn't quite agreement and wasn't quite disagreement. He pulled a muffin out of the bag and handed it to Ethan without being asked. Ethan took it. "You know," Frank said, "you don't have to carry everything yourself." "I'm not carrying anything." "Uh-huh." They stood there for a moment in the comfortable silence of two people who'd known each other long enough that silence wasn't a problem. The truth, which Ethan hadn't told Frank, hadn't told anyone, was that he hadn't slept more than 3 hours the previous night. He'd put Lily to bed at 8:30, same as always, and then he'd sat down at the kitchen table with his laptop and a glass of water that he never drank, and he'd spent the next several hours going through financial documents that had no business being as troubling as they were. It had started 6 weeks ago, almost by accident. The Kensington Foundation was not something Ethan talked about. He had a policy about this, about most things in his life that he considered private. And that policy was simple. Don't. The foundation had been established 9 years earlier by Victoria Kensington, heir to a real estate fortune and, by any reasonable measure, one of the more genuinely committed philanthropists operating in the Southeast. She ran shelters for children in crisis, programs for women escaping domestic violence, transitional housing for families who'd hit the particular kind of rock bottom that came with no warning and no roadmap out. The work was real. Ethan had verified that personally, years ago, before he'd put a single dollar toward it. He had started donating 5 years ago through a charitable trust he'd set up under the name Harbor Light Fund. Anonymous by design. He hadn't wanted recognition, had actively avoided it. The trust was structured so that even if someone traced it back, all they'd find was a legal entity with a Charleston address and a minimal paper trail. Where the money came from was its own complicated story, and not one that Ethan spent much time telling even to himself. The short version was that his late wife, Claire, had died 4 years ago. Cancer, fast and vicious, the kind that didn't give you time to say everything you needed to say, and had left behind, along with Lily and a grief that Ethan was still working through in the slow, private way that he worked through everything, a life insurance settlement and a small inheritance from her family. Claire had cared deeply about children who didn't have what Lily had. She'd volunteered at a shelter in Savannah before they'd moved, had talked about doing more someday when they had more to give. Ethan had used the money to do what she'd wanted to do. That was the whole story, as far as he was concerned. What was not supposed to be part of the story was the thing he'd noticed 6 weeks ago, when a quarterly report from the foundation had crossed his desk, forwarded to him automatically as part of the trust's donor relationship, and one of the line items had made him stop and read it twice. A construction disbursement, $2.4 million. A children's shelter in North Charleston, listed as completed. He had a specific memory of looking at that line item and feeling something shift slightly in his chest. Not alarm exactly, more like the mechanical equivalent of a sound a boat makes when something's not right. The kind of thing you can feel through your feet before you can name it. He knew that address. He'd driven past it 6 months ago, taking Lily to a birthday party in that part of the city. It had been an empty lot. He'd told himself he was misremembering. Looked up the address, found that the property records matched the location he was thinking of. Looked up aerial imagery and found an empty field. That was when he'd started paying closer attention. What he'd found over the following weeks, working quietly and methodically in the hours after Lily went to sleep, cross-referencing disbursement records against property registrations, permit filings, contractor licenses, was a pattern, not an obvious one. Whoever had built this had been careful, but careful wasn't the same as invisible, and Ethan had a particular gift for seeing the shape of things from incomplete information. 3 shelters that didn't exist, possibly more, construction companies that had no web presence, no licensed contractors, registered addresses that turned out to be mail drop services, money going out and nothing coming back except paperwork that looked real until you checked the details. Someone had been skimming from the Kensington Foundation, significantly, systematically, for what looked like at least 2 years. The question was who? And the answer, the name that kept appearing in the authorization chains, the signature on the disbursement approvals, the point of contact for the construction vendors, was always Richard Mercer. Richard Mercer was not a man Ethan had ever met in person. He'd seen him in photographs, the foundation's website, the society page of the Charleston Courier, a profile piece in a business magazine from about a year and a half ago. He looked exactly like what he was supposed to look like. 52 years old, silver-haired, expensive suits, the kind of face that conveyed competence and reasonableness in roughly equal measure. The kind of man who made other men nod when he spoke and made women in boardrooms feel they were dealing with someone who'd been told, early in life, to take up space and had followed that instruction faithfully. His official title was Chief Financial Officer of the Kensington Foundation. He had held that position for 4 years, having been recruited directly by Victoria Kensington from a financial services firm in Atlanta. His references had been impeccable. His credentials were real. And somewhere between legitimate employment and whatever he was doing now, he had made a decision. Ethan wasn't sure of the exact timeline yet. He needed more documents, and getting them legitimately was going to take time he wasn't sure he had. The Foundation's annual gala was in 3 weeks. The Harbor Legacy Gala, held every year at the Marquette Hotel, attended by the kind of donors whose checks had a lot of zeros, and whose continued support could make or break the organization's annual budget. If Ethan's reading of the financial records was right, Richard Mercer intended to make a very large transfer of funds immediately after the gala, when donor money would be at its seasonal peak, and then disappear. Which meant that if something was going to be done about this, it needed to happen in the next 3 weeks. The problem was, what exactly was Ethan supposed to do? He couldn't go to Victoria Kensington directly. Not yet. He had no proof that would survive scrutiny, just pattern recognition and a spreadsheet full of questions. Victoria had worked with Richard for 4 years. If Ethan walked in off the street, an anonymous donor whose identity she didn't even know, and told her that her CFO was stealing from children, the most likely outcome was that she'd protect the person she knew over the person she didn't. He could go to law enforcement, but the same problem applied. What he had was suggestive, not definitive. He'd spent enough time understanding how these things work to know that financial fraud cases required documentation, not hunches, however well informed. So he did what he always did when a problem was bigger than the immediate moment. He kept working. Victoria Kensington's morning began, as it almost always did, with a phone call she didn't particularly want to take. "We need to go over the seating arrangements again," Richard's voice said on the other end. "The Whitmore table has a conflict with the arrangement we discussed last week." Victoria set down her coffee, a habit she'd had for 15 years, drinking it black, a preference she'd developed in college and never questioned since, and looked out the window of her penthouse office, 22 floors above King Street. The city spread out below her in the particular gold and blue morning light that made Charleston look like the kind of place people put on postcards, which it was, which was something she occasionally forgot when she was deep in the machinery of running an organization this size. "Which conflict?" she said. "Harold Whitmore can't be seated near the Ashford Group. There's history there." "There's history everywhere? We'll put a table between them." She heard him start to object and cut him off. "Richard, I need the preliminary donor projections for the gala by Thursday. Are we on track?" "We're on track," he said. A pause. "Actually, there's one thing I want to flag. The Harbor Light Fund, our anonymous donor. There's been a change in their disbursement timing. I want to discuss how we handle messaging around that." Something in the way he said it was slightly off. Not the words themselves, but the rhythm of them. A fraction too smooth. Victoria filed it away without acknowledging she'd noticed. "Thursday," she said. "Projections on my desk." She ended the call and stood for a moment in the quiet of her office. Victoria Kensington was 30 years old and looked, most days, approximately 34. Not because she was aging badly, but because she carried the particular weight of someone who had been responsible for things since she was very young. Her father had died when she was 20, leaving her an estate worth somewhere north of $400 million and absolutely no instruction manual. She'd spent 2 years making the kinds of mistakes that rich 22-year-olds with too much money and not enough guidance made, and then she'd pivoted hard and built something she was genuinely proud of. The foundation employed 63 people. It operated or supported 14 shelters across South Carolina and Georgia. Last year, it had directly served over 2,000 women and children in crisis situations. She had built that number from zero over 9 years, and she knew every piece of the organization the way she knew her own apartment, where things were kept, what was working, what was quietly broken, and waiting for her attention. She thought for a moment about Richard's comment. The Harbor Light Fund disbursement timing. She made a mental note to look at the recent reports from that donor relationship. There was something she'd been meaning to check. The Harbor Grill sat half a block from the waterfront on East Bay Street, the kind of restaurant that had excellent food and terrible decor, and had somehow never bothered to fix the second because it didn't need to. The regulars, and there were many of them, came for the shrimp and grits, and stayed for the fact that nobody bothered them. Ethan sat in a corner booth at noon, across from Marcus Webb, who was eating a po' boy with the focused attention of someone who had not had lunch yet today and intended to make this one count. Marcus was 35, Ethan's oldest friend in Charleston, a man who'd grown up in North Charleston in circumstances that had either made people hard or made them something harder to define. He'd ended up, through a combination of stubbornness and natural ability, as an investigative paralegal at a civil litigation firm downtown. He wasn't a lawyer, but he knew how documents worked in ways that most lawyers didn't. He was also the only person in Charleston, in the world possibly, who knew the full truth about Ethan's financial situation. "So what's the updated number?" Marcus said, without looking up from his sandwich. "On what I've traced?" Ethan wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. "Conservatively, 12 million. I think it could be significantly more." Marcus set down the po' boy. $12 million. Over approximately 2 years, maybe longer. The earliest records I can access don't go back far enough. And this is all going through Mercer? Everything with a signature on it has his name on it. The vendors are ghosts. I've checked 6 of them. None have licensed contractors. 2 of the registered addresses are mail drops in Delaware. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Outside, through the window, a charter boat was making its way out of the harbor, moving slowly through the morning traffic. A pelican sat on a dock piling and watched it go with complete indifference. "Ethan," Marcus said carefully, "you realize you're talking about going after the CFO of one of the most visible nonprofit organizations in the state." "I know what I'm talking about." "And you want to do this? Why? Because it's your money he's stealing?" "Because it's children's money he's stealing." A beat. "Some of it's mine. Most of it isn't." Marcus studied him. They had known each other for 9 years, since Ethan had first come to Charleston, and Marcus had a specific look he used when he was trying to figure out whether Ethan was being completely honest or was leaving out something important. He was using that look now. "There's something you're not telling me," Marcus said. "There are several things I'm not telling you. Some of them are relevant, some aren't." "Which category does the anonymous donor thing fall into?" Ethan looked out the window. "Relevant." Marcus waited. "The Harbor Light Fund," Ethan said finally. "That's mine. I set it up 5 years ago." The silence that followed was the particular kind that happens when someone absorbs information they weren't expecting. Marcus processed it. Ethan watched him process it. "You've been donating to the Kensington Foundation for 5 years," Marcus said slowly. "Yes?" "Anonymously." "Yes." "How much?" Ethan told him. Marcus picked up his po' boy, looked at it for a moment without eating it, and set it back down. "And you never told anyone?" "No." "Why not?" "Because it wasn't anyone else's business." Marcus shook his head slowly, not in disagreement exactly, but in the way of someone recalibrating what they thought they knew about a person they'd known for nearly a decade. "Okay," he said. "Okay. So you have skin in the game is what you're telling me." "I have skin in the game. And you want to build a case that's solid enough to actually do something with. I need documentation that won't fall apart under scrutiny. The shell company structure, the fund transfers, the construction records. I can see the shape of it, but I need the pieces to connect cleanly, and I need to understand how he's planning to move the money post-gala, because that's when he makes the real move. That's the transaction that'll be large enough to be undeniable." Marcus was quiet for a long moment. "I know somebody," he said finally, "at the SEC field office in Atlanta. She's not going to want to move fast, but if we put together a package that's thorough enough, she'll move." "How thorough?" "Very." Marcus finally picked up his sandwich and took a bite, chewing thoughtfully. "You should also think about whether you want to keep being anonymous. If this goes where you're describing, there's going to be a moment where someone needs to know who Harbor Light is." Ethan didn't answer that right away. He turned his coffee cup in a slow circle on the table. "One problem at a time," he said. Emily Parker was 26 years old and had been employed as a junior accountant at the Kensington Foundation for 14 months. She had a master's degree in accounting from the University of South Carolina, a student loan balance she tried not to think about too hard, and the specific professional vulnerability of someone who was very good at her job but still knew enough that she could be removed without anyone important asking too many questions. She had noticed the discrepancy for the first time 8 weeks ago. It was a small thing. A rounding error in a disbursement record that didn't match the corresponding line in the vendor payment ledger. The kind of thing that happened sometimes and usually had a mundane explanation. A data entry mistake, a timing issue between fiscal periods, someone using slightly different figures from different report versions. She had flagged it to Richard's office. His assistant had told her it was already being looked at. 2 weeks later, she checked again. The discrepancy was still there, unaddressed. But the document had been edited. The timestamp showed it had been accessed and modified 3 days after she'd flagged it, and the modification hadn't corrected the discrepancy. It had buried it differently. Emily was good at her job. She didn't say anything. She started keeping copies. Over the following weeks, she had quietly pulled records that her access level shouldn't have permitted her to see, not through any hacking or technical trickery, but through the specific operational carelessness of an organization that had outgrown its information security practices. There were shared drives that hadn't been properly permissioned, old archive folders that hadn't been audited, a vendor payment database that was theoretically restricted but practically accessible to anyone who knew where to look. What she found made the small discrepancy look like a footnote. She'd been trying to decide what to do about it for 3 weeks when she saw Ethan Walker at the Whitmore donor reception. The Whitmore reception was not Ethan's idea of a good time. It was held at the Whitmore Group's offices on Upper King Street, a firm whose principal, Harold Whitmore, had been a donor to the Kensington Foundation for 7 years, and who hosted this particular pre-gala reception every year as part of his broader involvement with the organization's donor community. The event was cocktails and heavy hors d'oeuvres, and a lot of people in expensive clothes making the particular kind of small talk that was actually large talk in disguise, positioning and networking, and the careful performance of generosity. Ethan was there because Marcus had suggested it. You want to understand what Mercer knows about the investigation timeline? Get a look at how he operates in the donor room, see what he's worried about. Ethan had come in his work clothes because he'd come straight from the marina and hadn't had time to change, which he was aware was a problem the moment he walked through the door and encountered the gap between his reality and the room's expectations. He stayed near the back, held a glass of sparkling water he didn't drink, and watched. Richard Mercer worked the room with the ease of someone who had practiced this for decades. He moved from group to group in a way that looked casual but wasn't. There was sequencing to it, a deliberateness to which conversations he pursued and how long he stayed in each. He was performing the role of a man who had nothing to hide, and he was doing it well. Ethan was watching him work the Harrigan Group, 2 brothers who ran a shipping company out of Mount Pleasant and gave generously every year, when he felt the shift in the room's attention. Richard had spotted him. The walk across the room was unhurried, which was the point. Richard moved through the crowd with the confidence of a man who had decided something and was executing on it, pausing to say hello to 2 people on his way over, demonstrating that he was choosing to do this, not reacting to it. Ethan watched him come and didn't move. "I don't think we've met," Richard said, stopping in front of him. His voice was the voice of someone who had been told, at some point in his life, that he had a good voice. "Richard Mercer. I'm the Foundation's CFO. Ethan Walker." He didn't offer his hand, not aggressively, just didn't reach for it. Richard's eyes moved over him. The work clothes, the boots, the lack of a name tag, which meant he'd either lost it or hadn't picked one up. "And how do you know the Foundation, Ethan?" "I do some repair work on the harbor. Maintenance." "Ah." And there it was, the infinitesimal pause before the pivot that signaled everything. "Maintenance. Right. Well, we're always glad to have community members take an interest in what we do." He said it pleasantly, with complete professionalism, and it was one of the more effective dismissals Ethan had encountered. The message was perfectly clear: you don't belong here. "Absolutely," Ethan said. He watched Richard's eyes scan the room, already moving on. "Well, enjoy the evening," Richard said, "and feel free to grab some food. The crab cakes are excellent." He said it the way someone would say it to a maintenance worker. And then he was gone, already turning toward a more useful conversation. Around them, a few people who'd caught the exchange looked away with practiced diplomacy. The implicit verdict was clear. The harbor mechanic had been gracefully put in his place. Ethan stood where he was and took a slow sip of his sparkling water. He wasn't embarrassed. He was thinking about the 3-second pause before Richard had said maintenance, and what it meant that Richard had filed him away in a particular category that quickly, and what that suggested about how Richard saw the people around him. It told him something useful. "That was interesting," said a voice beside him. He turned. A young woman, late 20s, dark hair pulled back, blazer over a simple black dress, a glass of white wine that looked untouched. She was looking at the space where Richard had been, not at Ethan. Was it? Ethan said. You didn't react the way most people would. She glanced at him sideways. Most people get uncomfortable when Richard does that. You looked like you were studying him. I was. She turned to look at him more directly. Her expression was careful, the look of someone who was deciding how much to say. I'm Emily. I work in the Foundation's accounting department. Ethan. A beat passed. The crab cakes are terrible, by the way, she said. I don't know why he always says that. Despite himself, Ethan almost smiled. Almost. Good to know. Emily looked at her wine glass, then back at the room. If you're actually interested in the Foundation's work, she said, very quietly, very carefully, and not just in whatever that conversation was, you might want to look at the Q3 disbursement report, the one that was published last month. A pause. Specifically, the North Charleston project line items. Ethan said nothing. His face gave nothing. Emily set her wine glass down on a nearby table. It was nice to meet you, Ethan. She walked away. He watched her go. Then he looked across the room at Richard Mercer, who was laughing at something Harold Whitmore had said, comfortable and certain in the middle of the room. He picked Lily up at 3:15. She came out of the school building at a dead run, the way she always did, as if the contained stillness of the classroom had built up pressure all day, and the release was a full sprint into the parking lot. He was standing by the truck, and she hit him at speed, backpack bouncing, and he caught her with both arms and lifted her briefly before setting her down. Did you get fired? She said. What? You left early. Frank texted me. She reached into her jacket pocket and produced his phone, which she had apparently been carrying. You left it on the workbench. He took the phone. There were 3 texts from Frank, which was 3 more than Frank usually sent. I had a meeting. What kind of meeting? A work kind. About boats? He opened the truck door for her. Sort of. She climbed in, and he went around to the driver's side, and they were halfway home before she spoke again. Dad? Yeah. Is something wrong? He glanced at her in the rear-view mirror. 8 years old, and she read him better than most adults he'd known. He'd wondered sometimes whether that was a gift or a burden, whether it cost her something to be so attuned to him, whether it meant she was using attention she should be spending on her own life to monitor his. Nothing's wrong with us, he said. There's something going on with some other people that I'm trying to help with. It takes up a little extra space in my head. That's all. She thought about this. Are they people you know? Sort of. Is it dangerous? He checked the mirror again. She was watching him with that direct look of hers, not frightened, just measuring. No, he said. She accepted this, or appeared to. With Lily, those were sometimes different things. That night, after she was asleep, Ethan went back to his laptop and spent 3 hours building the cleanest version of the financial case he could put together from what he had. He organized it the way Marcus had taught him, chronologically, with every assumption flagged, every inference labeled as inference rather than fact. He found 2 more construction vendors that matched the pattern, registered in 2021, no licensed contractors, mail drop addresses, payment records that matched exactly to the fund transfer timeline. At some point around 2 in the morning, he leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling and thought about Claire. Not in a painful way exactly. Or not only in a painful way. In the way he sometimes did, which was to ask himself quietly and privately whether he was doing the right thing. She had believed that helping people was simple, that you saw the need and you met it, and the complications were just the practical machinery of doing what was already obvious. He had been the one who saw complications everywhere, who wanted to think through consequences, who moved carefully. He didn't know who was right. He suspected she was, and suspected he would always suspect this, even years from now. He closed the laptop and went to bed. 3 days later, he got a call from a number he didn't recognize. He almost didn't answer it. He was under the hull of a 30-foot sailboat, working on a shaft seal, and his phone was in his shirt pocket where it vibrated twice before he registered it. He pulled it out, looked at the number, area code 803, which was Columbia, though that didn't mean much, and picked up. Mr. Walker, said a voice he didn't know. My name is Emily Parker. We met briefly at the Whitmore reception. He was quiet for a moment. I remember. I need to talk to someone, she said. Not on the phone. Okay. I know that's vague. I'm sorry, a pause. I've been looking at records for 8 weeks, and I don't know what to do with what I found. And you were the only person at that reception who looked at Richard Mercer the same way I've been looking at him. And I don't know if that means anything, but I don't have a lot of options. It wasn't a speech she'd rehearsed. It came out uneven, slightly rushed, with the quality of someone saying more than they'd intended because the pressure had been building for too long. Ethan pulled himself out from under the sailboat, sat up on the dock, looked out at the harbor. There's a coffee shop on Cannon Street, he said. The small one, not the chain. You know it? I can find it. Tomorrow at 7:30, before work. A long pause. How do I know you're not going to... She stopped. You don't, he said simply. But you called me. That tells you something about what you already decided. Another pause, then, okay. He hung up. Sat for a moment with his phone in his hand, looking at the sunlight moving on the water. He thought about the empty field in North Charleston, about $12 million that was supposed to be walls and roofs and beds for children who didn't have any of those things. Then he put his phone back in his pocket and went back to work. There was still a shaft seal to fix, and it wasn't going to fix itself. The coffee shop on Cannon Street was called Lola's, and it had 8 tables, no Wi-Fi password posted anywhere visible, and a chalkboard menu that hadn't changed meaningfully in 4 years. The owner, a compact woman in her 50s named Darlene, made the coffee strong and minded her own business, which was the reason Ethan had been coming here for 3 years. He arrived at 7:15, ordered a black coffee, took the table in the back corner where he could see both the door and the window, and waited. Emily Parker came in at 7:32, slightly out of breath, carrying a canvas tote bag over one shoulder and the look of someone who had changed their mind about coming at least once on the way over and had made a decision to override it. She spotted him, walked over, and sat down without saying hello first. I almost didn't come, she said. I figured. How did you figure that? You're 2 minutes late. You don't seem like someone who's usually 2 minutes late. She looked at him for a moment, assessing, recalibrating something. Then she flagged Darlene down and ordered a coffee, and while she waited for it, she set the tote bag on the table and kept her hand on top of it. I need to know who you are, she said, before I show you anything. I told you. I repair boats on the waterfront. That's what you do. It's not who you are. She looked at him steadily. Because the man who repairs boats on the waterfront doesn't look at Richard Mercer the way you looked at him, and the man who repairs boats doesn't know to ask about the Q3 disbursement reports. She paused. I didn't actually tell you to look at those. I told you to look at the North Charleston project lines. But you already knew which report they were in, didn't you? Ethan was quiet for a moment. The coffee arrived. He waited until Darlene had moved back toward the counter. I'm a donor, he said, to the foundation. I've been following the financials for a while. How much of a donor? Enough to have access to the quarterly reports. She studied him. He watched her work through the implications of that, watched her decide whether to push further or accept it. Okay, she said finally. She opened the tote bag and pulled out a manila folder, then held it without opening it. I want to be clear about something. I'm not a whistleblower. I'm not trying to blow up the foundation or damage Victoria Kensington or make a name for myself. I like this job. I care about what the foundation is supposed to do. Her voice was steady, but there was an edge underneath it. I've been sitting on this for 8 weeks because I didn't know who to trust, and I still don't. Fully, but I also can't keep sitting on it. Does that make sense? It makes complete sense. She opened the folder. What Emily had assembled was not as comprehensive as what Ethan had built over the past 6 weeks, but it was different in important ways. His evidence came from the donor-facing financial reports, the sanitized versions that the foundation released to its giving community. Emily had access to the internal ledgers, the vendor payment authorizations, the actual transaction records that never left the building. The discrepancies between the two sets of records were not subtle once you knew to look for them. In the external reports, disbursements to construction vendors appeared as clean line items with generic descriptions. In the internal records, Those same transactions had authorization chains that looped through a single approval node, Richard's electronic signature, and vendor account numbers that, when Emily had cross-referenced them, connected to a set of bank accounts registered to LLCs in Delaware, Nevada, and one in Wyoming. I checked the Wyoming one, Emily said, tapping a page in the folder. The registered agent is a law firm in Casper. They represent about 400 LLCs, cookie-cutter shell company infrastructure. Who does the Delaware one trace back to? That's where it gets harder. The registered agent is similar, a filing service, not a real law firm, but I found a secondary contact email in one of the vendor setup documents. Someone had to input that email when they registered the vendor in our system. She turned to a page near the back. The email domain is from a private provider. I can't access the account itself, but the username, she pointed. Look familiar? Ethan looked at the username, R.Mercer_consulting. He looked up at Emily. He didn't even bother to use a different name, she said, and there was something in her voice that sounded like the particular anger of someone who had been disappointed by the sloppiness of it. Not just the crime itself, but the disrespect of it, the laziness of a man who expected to never be questioned. How far back does this go in the internal records? Ethan said. The earliest I can find with this pattern is about 2.5 years ago. She turned another page. But look at the transaction volumes. In the first year, the amounts are smaller, under $500,000 in total. Then they escalate. In the last 12 months, she put her finger on a total at the bottom of a column. That's just what I can document cleanly. Ethan looked at the number. It was larger than what he'd estimated. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the page. Outside, through the window, a delivery truck was trying to parallel park on Cannon Street and failing in a slow, committed way. A cyclist swerved around it. Ordinary morning. Has anyone else in the accounting department noticed this? He said. I don't know. I haven't asked anyone directly. She folded her hands on the table. I had a supervisor, Janet Marsh, senior accountant, been there 11 years. About 3 weeks ago, she told me she was leaving. Voluntary resignation, she said. Opportunity elsewhere. But she was gone in 48 hours, and Richard was the one who handled the transition, not HR. Emily paused. I tried calling her. She didn't answer. I left a message. She hasn't called back. Ethan thought about that. Have you documented everything you're showing me? Kept copies somewhere outside the Foundation's systems? Yes. Encrypted. Off-site. She looked at him. I'm not naive about what I'm dealing with. No, you're not. He looked at her for a moment. The controlled tension in how she held herself, the way her eyes were slightly tired from weeks of late nights, and the specific strain of carrying something like this alone. She was 26, he remembered, and she'd handled this with more discipline than most people twice her age would have managed. You've done good work, he said. Careful work. She blinked, seemed momentarily at a loss for what to do with a direct compliment. I just did what made sense. Most people don't. He slid the folder back across the table to her. Keep this with you. Don't leave it anywhere connected to the Foundation. And don't tell anyone else what you've told me. Not yet. What are you going to do? I'm going to talk to someone who knows how to build a legal case from this kind of documentation, and I'm going to need a few more pieces before this is solid enough to survive. How much time do we have? Ethan picked up his coffee, which had gone slightly cold while they were talking. The gala is in 18 days. Whatever he's planning, and I believe he's planning to move a significant amount right after the gala donations come in, it happens in that window. Emily absorbed this. 18 days. So we move carefully, but we don't move slow. She looked down at the folder in her hands. There was a long pause, the kind where someone is working through something internal, something the conversation couldn't help with. What happens to the Foundation if this goes public? She said quietly. To Victoria, to the shelters that are actually real. It was the right question to ask, and the fact that she was asking it told him something about her that the folder full of meticulous documentation had also already told him. If it goes right, Ethan said, the Foundation survives, the money gets recovered, and the people who are actually serving in those shelters keep working. He met her eyes. That's what we're building toward. Not the exposure, the survival. She nodded slowly. Something settled in her face, Not relief exactly, but the look of someone who had found a direction to move in after weeks of standing still. "Okay," she said. "What do you need from me?" They stayed in Lola's for another 40 minutes. By the time Emily left, she had a specific list and Ethan had a significantly clearer picture of the internal mechanics of what Richard had built. He sat for a few more minutes after she left, turning his coffee cup in circles on the table, thinking. Then he paid for both coffees. Emily had tried to pay for her own and he'd waved it off without discussion, and went back to the marina. There were boats to fix. There were always boats to fix. And for the first time in 6 weeks, the shape of what he was dealing with had edges he could see all the way to. That didn't make it less serious. If anything, it made it more serious. What Emily had shown him pushed the documented total well past $15 million. And the acceleration curve in those final 12 months told a story that Ethan read clearly. Richard Mercer was not a man who had slowly lost his way. He was a man who had been planning an exit. The gala was the last stop. Ethan needed to make sure it was also the last thing Richard Mercer thought he'd gotten away with. Victoria had been up since 5:30, which was an hour earlier than usual, which meant that something was wrong even before she could articulate what it was. She stood at her kitchen counter in an oversized sweatshirt that had been her father's, and made coffee, and stared at the city through the floor-to-ceiling windows of her apartment while the sky went from dark gray to a thin, colorless pre-dawn, and then slowly to something approaching light. The city at this hour was different, quieter, stripped of its performance, just the actual physical fact of buildings and streets, and the harbor in the distance with its lights reflecting on the dark water. She had been trying to put her finger on something for 3 days. It had started with Richard's comment about the Harbor Light Fund disbursement timing. She had gone back and looked at the donor communication records, as she'd told herself she would, and what she found was not wrong exactly. The disbursements were there, the acknowledgement letters had been sent, the donor relationship was being properly maintained on paper. But there was something about the way the most recent correspondence was worded. The letters responding to Harbor Light's most recent transfer had a slightly different formality to them than the earlier ones. Not dramatically different. Different the way a lock feels different when someone who doesn't live in your house has used the key. Almost the same, not quite. She was aware that this could be nothing. She was aware that she was running on 5.5 hours of sleep and the accumulated pressure of a fundraising gala 16 days away and a dozen operational problems that needed her attention. She was aware that she had built an organization that functioned largely because she trusted her people, and that starting to distrust them without a specific reason was a kind of paranoia that could do real damage. She thought about this and made herself a list, the way she always did when she was uncertain. What do I actually know? What am I inferring? What am I just feeling? The list was not reassuring. She texted Richard at 7:15. Just the Thursday projections. A reminder, nothing else, nothing that would signal she was thinking about anything beyond the gala logistics. He responded within 4 minutes, which he always did, because he was always available when she needed him, which had always seemed like a virtue. She sat with that for a moment. Then she called her lawyer. Sarah Chen, no relation to Lily's teacher, had handled the foundation's legal affairs for 6 years and operated on the principle that the most important thing she could do for her clients was tell them things they didn't want to hear clearly enough that they actually heard them. She picked up on the second ring, which meant she was already at her desk, which was normal for Sarah. "You have a question," Sarah said in lieu of hello. "Ask it." "Hypothetically," Victoria said, "if I wanted to conduct an internal financial review, not a standard audit, something more targeted, who would I use and how would I do it without creating the impression that I suspect anyone specific of anything?" A pause. "That's a very carefully worded hypothetical." "I know." "Is there a specific area of concern?" Victoria looked at the harbor. "Construction disbursements, the last 2 years?" Another pause, this one longer. "Victoria, do you have reason to believe—" "I don't know what I have reason to believe. That's why I'm calling you." Sarah was quiet for a moment, and in that silence, Victoria could hear the particular quality of a very smart person deciding how to be honest without overreaching. "I can connect you with a forensic accounting firm," Sarah said finally. "They're discreet. But understand that once you engage them, you're past the point of hypothetical. Whatever they find becomes information you're responsible for acting on. I understand that. And if the issue is what the careful wording of your question suggests it might be, Sarah. Yes. Get me the contact information. She ended the call and stood for a moment in her kitchen, not quite sure what she felt. There was a particular weight to taking an action that you couldn't take back, even when it was the right action. She'd felt it before. The weight of the decision to start the foundation. The weight of the first time she'd had to let someone go. The specific gravity of moments when you crossed a line from not knowing to trying to know. She finished her coffee. Then she got dressed and went to work. And for the rest of the day, she performed the version of herself that Richard and the rest of her staff expected. Present, decisive, focused entirely on the gala. While something cold and methodical ran quietly underneath. Richard Mercer called a department meeting that afternoon, which was mildly unusual but not unprecedented. He used these periodic all-hands sessions to align the team on messaging and ensure everyone was carrying the same narrative about the Foundation's work. He was good at them, clear, inclusive, good at making people feel like they were part of something important. Emily sat in the second row and took notes, and watched him the way Ethan had watched him at the Whitmore reception. Not with fear. She'd moved past fear somewhere in the past few weeks, replaced it with something colder and more useful. She watched the way he framed things, the words he chose when he talked about the Foundation's financial health, the specific phrases he used to characterize the upcoming gala, and what it meant for the organization's annual projections. "This is going to be our strongest year," Richard said, leaning against the conference room table with the relaxed posture of a man in complete command of his environment. "The partnerships we've built, the donor relationships we've cultivated. This gala is the culmination of all of it. What we raise in the next 16 days sets the foundation for everything we want to accomplish in the coming year." He looked around the room as he said it, making eye contact, warm and genuine seeming. His eyes passed over Emily without pausing. She had her notebook open in her lap. Underneath her actual notes, in handwriting she kept small and tidy at the bottom of each page. She was keeping a second record. Impressions, statements, the things he said publicly that she could cross-reference against the internal records she'd been building her case from. It was probably excessive. She did it anyway. After the meeting, she passed Richard in the hallway outside the conference room. He smiled at her. The general warm smile he directed at all his direct reports. Impersonal, but not cold. "Good work on the Q3 reconciliation," he said. "Thank you," she said. She went back to her desk and stared at her screen for a moment after she sat down. She thought about the Q3 reconciliation, the report she'd submitted 3 weeks ago, the one that had required her to access the archive folders she wasn't supposed to be in. The reconciliation itself had been clean. The underlying records she'd found in the process had not been. Had he noticed what she'd accessed? Was the compliment about the reconciliation a signal, or was she reading meaning into something that was just professional courtesy from a man who was careful to maintain good relationships with his team? She didn't know. She couldn't know. That was the particular misery of this kind of thing. You were working with incomplete information in an environment where you couldn't afford to make a mistake, and the person you were watching was better at this than you and had been doing it for longer. She texted Ethan. The message was short. Something he said today. "Can we talk?" His response came 20 minutes later. "Tomorrow morning, same place." She put her phone face down on her desk and went back to work. The next morning at Lola's, she told him about the meeting and the comment in the hallway. Ethan listened without interrupting, which she was beginning to understand was simply how he listened to everything. "Do you think he knows you've been looking?" he said when she was done. "I think he might suspect someone has been looking. Whether he suspects me specifically." She shook her head. "I don't know. He's careful. If he thought I was a threat, I don't know if he'd telegraph it." "What would he do?" She thought about Janet Marsh, who had been with the Foundation for 11 years and had been gone in 48 hours. "Remove the problem quietly." Ethan looked at his coffee cup for a moment. "I need you to do something that might feel counterintuitive." "Okay." "Pull back. Not completely. Don't change your routine enough to be visible, but stop accessing the archive folders. Stop any cross-referencing you've been doing inside the system. For the next 2 weeks, you're just an accountant doing her job. Emily felt something tighten in her chest. I'm close to finding the Wyoming account ownership. I think with 2 more days, Emily. His voice wasn't sharp, but it was definite. What you've already found is enough to build on. If he thinks someone is actively investigating him inside the organization, he moves faster, or he moves the money earlier. We need him to feel safe until we're ready. He looked at her. I know it's hard to stop when you're in it. She looked at her hands. I've been doing this for 2 months. It feels like if I stop, it disappears. It won't disappear. It's documented. It's real. He leaned forward slightly. The goal isn't to find everything. The goal is to find enough, and to have it in the right hands before the gala. She exhaled slowly. Okay. A pause. What are the right hands? He told her about Marcus and about the contact at the SEC field office in Atlanta. He told her what the timeline looked like from his end, the pattern he'd traced through the donor-facing records, the shell company structure he'd been able to partially map, the post-gala transfer he believed Richard was planning, and the rough amount he expected it to involve. Emily listened with the focused attention of someone filing information, making connections. He's going to announce a new financial partnership at the gala, she said. I saw the draft press release 2 days ago. A strategic endowment initiative. It's framed as a major expansion of the foundation's investment infrastructure. Ethan was very still. What kind of initiative? It gives him authority to move a significant portion of the gala proceeds into a new investment fund. The fund is managed externally. She paused. By a firm I haven't been able to identify. The name in the draft was Meridian Capital Partners. I'll look for it. Ethan. She waited until he looked at her directly. If he announces that partnership at the gala and donors commit to it publicly, this goes from a fraud case to something a lot bigger. He's not just stealing from existing funds. He's building a new mechanism in real time, with witnesses. The weight of that sat between them for a moment. I know, he said. He spent that evening the way he'd spent too many recent evenings, at the kitchen table after Lily was asleep, working through records on his laptop while the rest of the house was quiet. But tonight there was a specific focus. Meridian Capital Partners. He'd never heard of them, which was itself a data point. He'd spent 5 years in the donor community, had paid attention to the financial infrastructure around the foundation, knew most of the significant players in the Southeast philanthropic investment space. A firm significant enough to be named in a foundation press release should exist somewhere in that landscape. It didn't. He found a registered entity in Georgia, Meridian Capital Partners, LLC, registered 8 months ago. Single managing member, a name he didn't recognize. He spent an hour trying to trace the name and found only a thin digital presence that felt constructed rather than accumulated. A LinkedIn profile with no photo and a work history that was plausible but verified to nothing. He searched the registered agent's other clients, found 17 LLCs formed in the past 2 years through the same agent, all in the same registration category. 2 of the names he recognized. He'd seen them in the vendor payment records Emily had shown him. A third matched an address he'd found in his own research 3 weeks ago. Richard hadn't just built a system to steal from. He'd built an exit infrastructure, and he'd been constructing it for a long time. Ethan called Marcus at 10:45, which was late, but not egregiously so by Marcus's standards. Meridian Capital Partners, he said when Marcus picked up. Georgia LLC, formed 8 months ago. I'm sending you the registration details now. He heard Marcus typing. A pause. Oh, that's not subtle. No. You want me to send this to Atlanta? Not yet. I need 2 more things first. Ethan looked at the screen. I need to know the actual account structure behind Meridian, where money paid to them ends up, and I need to understand the timing of the endowment announcement at the gala. If donors are making commitments publicly that night, we can't wait until after the gala to move. Marcus was quiet for a moment. You're talking about doing this at the gala. I'm saying we need to be ready for it to happen at the gala if the timeline forces it. Another pause. That's a very different thing than building a package for the SEC. I know. You're talking about a room full of donors, media, the foundation's entire board. Marcus, I'm just making sure you understand what you're describing. I understand it. Ethan leaned back in his chair. You know what he said to me at the Whitmore reception? That the crab cakes were excellent. He pointed me to the food. Like I was the catering staff. Like I'd come to the wrong party and someone needed to manage me gently towards something more appropriate. A pause. I don't care about that. I genuinely don't. But that's who he is. He looks at people and categorizes them by how useful or threatening they are. The people in that shelter he stole from, the ones that don't exist, they were categories to him, line items. Marcus was quiet. I'm not going to let him walk away from a room full of people celebrating his work, Ethan said. Even if you have to be in that room. Even then. A long silence. Then, I'll call Atlanta first thing tomorrow. After Ethan hung up, he sat for a long moment at the kitchen table. The house was quiet. The settling sounds of an old house, the refrigerator cycling on and off, the soft background noise of the city outside. He thought about the gala, the Marquette Hotel, which he'd driven past 100 times but never been inside. The ballroom full of people who had given money in good faith and would be standing in a room with a man who had spent 4 years treating their generosity as a personal cash flow opportunity. He thought about Victoria Kensington, whom he had never met. He had read everything publicly available about her. The profiles, the speeches, the interviews she'd given about the foundation's work. He had the impression of someone who had come to this work from a complicated place and had built something real out of it. He didn't know her, but he knew, from the financial records and from 5 years of watching the foundation operate, that the actual work was genuine. The shelters that existed were real. The women and children they served were real. Whatever Richard had done, whatever Victoria might or might not have known, the thing Ethan was trying to protect was real. He also thought about what Marcus had pointed at, the thing underneath the logistics, that doing this at the gala meant stepping out of the shadow he'd been standing in for 5 years. The anonymous donor becoming visible, the maintenance worker standing in the middle of a room that had quietly decided he didn't belong there. He wasn't sure how he felt about that, and he was honest enough with himself to admit it. Not because he wanted the attention, he genuinely didn't, but because he had spent a long time constructing a life that was legible. Boats, Lily, the waterfront, the ordinary texture of a day that made sense. Walking into that ballroom was going to change something about how he was seen in the world, and he couldn't fully predict the shape of it. He closed the laptop. Thought about Claire. The way she used to say when he was overthinking something, that sometimes the right move was just the obvious move, and the overthinking was its own kind of avoidance. He was probably overthinking this. He got up, rinsed his coffee mug, checked the lock on the front door, an old habit, the way parents developed old habits, and went down the hall toward his room. He stopped at Lily's doorway. The door was cracked the way she liked it, a sliver of hallway light crossing the floor. She was asleep on her stomach with one arm hanging off the mattress, in a posture that looked deeply uncomfortable and apparently wasn't, because she slept this way regularly. Her drawing notebook was half under her pillow, which meant she'd been working on something before she fell asleep. He stood there for a moment, not going in, just watching her breathe. Then he went to bed. 3 days later, Emily Parker was called into Richard's office. She had been expecting something. Not specifically this, but something. A shift in tone, a question that was too specific to be casual, some indication that the perimeter she'd been trying to maintain around her investigation had developed a gap she hadn't seen. She'd been running the last 3 days on the careful surface calm of someone who knows they might be watched, and has decided to be exactly what they appear to be, nothing more. Richard's office was on the 3rd floor, corner room, with windows that looked out over the foundation's small garden and the street beyond. He was standing when she came in, which she noted, not behind the desk, but near the windows, like the desk was too formal for what he wanted this to feel like. "Emily," he said, "close the door." She closed it, stayed standing. "I wanted to talk to you about your role here," he said. He had the tone of someone delivering disappointing news with genuine regret, which was a specific register that Ethan had identified, but that Emily felt in her chest as a different kind of cold. "You've been a strong addition to the team, sharp, thorough. I mean that." "Thank you," she said, "which makes this harder." He picked up a single sheet of paper from the windowsill. A piece of theater, she thought, because whatever that paper said, the decision had been made before this meeting. The gala is generating some structural changes in the department. We're consolidating some roles going into the new year, and your position is one that's affected. Emily looked at the paper. My position is being eliminated? Restructured. The work continues, it just shifts in how it's organized. He set the paper down. We'd like to offer you a generous severance, 2 months, and of course outstanding references. I want to make sure this transition is as smooth as possible for you. She was quiet for a moment. She needed to be careful. She needed to be a normal person who had just been fired, not someone who knew why she'd been fired. Can I ask what changed? She said. I haven't received any performance concerns. It's not performance-based, he said smoothly. These decisions are purely structural. Budget, scope realignment, it's not a reflection on your work. She nodded once. When is my last day? Friday. He said it without flinching. Today was Tuesday. We'd like to handle the transition cleanly, so after today we'll have IT manage your system access as we move through the process. Standard procedure for role eliminations. Her system access. The record she'd been careful not to touch for 3 days, which meant that after today, she couldn't access them even if she'd wanted to. Of course, she said. I understand. He extended his hand. She shook it because not shaking it would have been the only thing in this conversation that wasn't careful and controlled. She left his office, walked to her desk, sat down, and for exactly 4 minutes she stared at her screen and did not react. Then she picked up her phone, typed a text to Ethan under her desk. He just fired me. System access gone by end of day. Meet tonight? She set the phone back down, looked at her screen. Then, because she was at work and she was a professional, and she had 4 minutes of controlled reaction used up, and it was time to be done with that, she opened the quarterly budget file she'd been working on before the meeting and went back to work. Ethan's response came 8 minutes later, Lola's, 7 p.m. She kept her face neutral and kept working. He was already there when she arrived, sitting in the same corner table, the same black coffee. He looked up when she came in and she read something in his expression that she hadn't seen there before. Not surprise exactly, but a kind of recognition, like something he'd been expecting had arrived. She sat down, didn't bother with pleasantries. He knows, she said. Maybe, Ethan said, or he's cleaning house before the gala as a precaution. Either way, it doesn't change what we do. It changes the timeline. He pushed a folded piece of paper across the table. Marcus got confirmation from the SEC contact in Atlanta. They're interested, but they need the account chain for Meridian Capital, the actual destination bank. Emily looked at the paper. I don't have that. I was trying to get it when... I know, but there's another way in. He looked at her. The vendor setup documents you mentioned. The ones where you found the R. Mercer _consulting email. Those were entered into the Foundation's system. That means they were transmitted from somewhere through the Foundation's email server to the accounting system. He paused. Your system access is gone, but the IT logs for those transmissions still exist, and I know someone who might be able to get to them without going through the Foundation's current infrastructure. Emily stared at him. You have an IT contact? I have Marcus, who has a contact at a data recovery firm that does forensic work for law firms. It's not the same as having a contact inside the Foundation's IT department. It's slower and less direct, but it might get us what we need. She was quiet for a moment. Ethan, he fired me 4 hours ago. My access is gone. Whatever I had in those files is backed up on your encrypted drive. Yes. Then you still have everything you've already found. The only thing we've lost is the ability to find new things from inside. He met her eyes. That was going to have to end at some point anyway. She absorbed this. He was right, and she knew he was right, and somehow that didn't make it feel less like a door closing. What do I do now? You go home, you sleep. Tomorrow you don't go into the Foundation's offices for the severance paperwork. Email them and say you'll handle it remotely. You stay out of the building. They'll think It doesn't matter what they think anymore. What matters is that Richard Mercer goes into that gala in 12 days believing he's handled whatever made him uncomfortable. We need him relaxed and confident and feeling in control. Emily looked down at the table. She turned her coffee cup in a slow circle, a gesture that, she realized after a moment, was something she'd seen Ethan do. Some borrowed habit she'd picked up without noticing. There are 240 children currently in shelters the foundation directly supports, she said quietly. I looked it up last week. Ethan didn't say anything. I keep thinking about that number, she said, that it's not abstract. It's 240 specific people who are there because the foundation works, because some part of this organization is actually doing what it's supposed to do. She looked up at him. We can't let the investigation damage that. We're not going to, he said. She heard it in his voice, not the reassurance of someone managing her feelings, but the statement of someone who had already decided. She had spent 2 months uncertain about almost everything connected to this situation. In this moment, she was certain about exactly one thing, and that was that Ethan Walker was not going to let those shelters come apart. She didn't know how she knew that. She just did. She picked up her coffee and drank it, cold as it was. Okay, she said. What do we do in the 12 days before the gala? He told her. And outside, through the window of Lola's, the city went on. Traffic moving on Cannon Street. Someone's music from an open apartment window 2 floors up. A dog pulling at its leash while its owner looked at their phone. The ordinary, unmistakable noise of a city that didn't know what was being built in a corner coffee shop at 7:15 on a Wednesday evening by a mechanic who couldn't sleep and a 26-year-old accountant who had just lost her job. 12 days was not a long time. It would have to be enough. 12 days felt like a long time until it didn't. The first 3 passed in a kind of controlled urgency that Ethan managed the way he managed most things, methodically, without wasted motion. He worked his regular hours at the marina, picked Lily up from school, made dinner, helped her with homework, put her to bed. Then he sat at the kitchen table and worked on the other thing until he couldn't keep his eyes open. Marcus had a contact at a forensic data firm called Lighthouse Analytics, a small operation run by a former FBI digital forensics specialist named Danny Cho, who now worked exclusively for civil litigation and occasionally, when Marcus asked, for situations that occupied the gray zone between civil and criminal. Danny was not cheap and was not fast, but he was thorough in the way that only someone who had spent 15 years building federal cases understood thorough to mean. Ethan had called Danny directly on the morning after Emily's firing and explained what he needed. The email transmissions from the vendor setup process, specifically the routing headers that would show where the emails originating the vendor account for Meridian Capital Partners had been sent from. If Richard had set up the account from a personal device, the metadata would trace to that device. If he'd used a separate email infrastructure, that infrastructure would have its own traceable signature. Danny had listened without interrupting, asked 4 questions, and said he could have something in 4 to 5 days. I need it in 3, Ethan said. 4, Danny said, and that's me moving fast. He got it in 4 days, which was also 3 days before the gala. The results were not what Ethan had expected, but they were better. The vendor registration emails for Meridian Capital Partners had been sent from a device registered to a mobile data account, not a business account, a personal cellular plan. The account was registered to a name that wasn't Richard Mercer's, but the billing address on the account matched a property in Mount Pleasant that, when Ethan ran it through the county property records, was owned by a limited liability company. The LLC's registered agent was the same firm in Delaware that had registered 2 of the other vendor shell companies. It was not a direct line. It was a trail of breadcrumbs that required someone to walk the whole path to see where it led. But it connected. Every piece connected, if you were willing to follow it far enough. He sent the full package to Marcus that night. Everything he had, everything Emily had given him, Danny's forensic report, his own traced analysis of the shell company network. Marcus assembled it into the format his SEC contact had specified and submitted it electronically at 11:40 the following morning. The contact's name was Sandra Reyes. She was a senior enforcement specialist at the SEC's Atlanta regional office and had been there for 11 years, which meant she had seen most of the ways that financial fraud could be constructed and had the particular professional patience of someone who had learned not to rush the moment when things became legally actionable. She called Marcus at 2 in the afternoon. Marcus called Ethan at 2:17. She's taking it, Marcus said, without any preamble. She's putting a team on the Meridian account chain and the Shell Company network tonight. She says if the bank account trail confirms what the document trail suggests, she can have federal agents in Charleston before the end of the week. Ethan set down the wrench he'd been holding. He was under the hull of a 32-foot motor yacht whose owner had managed, through what must have been genuinely impressive negligence, to crack both propeller shafts. He sat up on the dock. "What does she need from us?" he said. "She needs the gala timeline. Specifically, she wants to know when and how Richard is planning to announce the Meridian partnership." "I can get that." "Ethan," Marcus paused. "She also asked about the anonymous donor. She said it's going to come up during the case, that the prosecution will want to establish the full scope of the fraud, and the Harbor Light Fund is going to be part of that picture. She wants to know if you're prepared for your name to be part of the record." Ethan was quiet for a moment. On the water 30 feet from where he was sitting, a kayaker was making slow progress against the incoming tide, paddling steadily without seeming to gain much ground. "Tell her yes," he said. After he hung up, he sat on the dock for a few minutes longer than he needed to. He thought about what it would mean for Lily. Not immediately, not catastrophically, but in the way that visibility always had small consequences. People would know. People he'd never met would have opinions about the choices he'd made and why he'd made them. He decided he could live with that. He went back to work on the propeller shafts. Victoria received the anonymous package on a Tuesday morning. It came by messenger. A sealed envelope addressed to her personally, delivered to the Foundation's reception desk at 8:50 a.m. with no return address. The receptionist brought it up with the rest of the morning mail. Victoria opened it at her desk between a meeting and a phone call, expecting something routine. It was not routine. Inside was a USB drive and a single printed page. The page had no letterhead, no signature. It read, "The following documentation concerns financial irregularities in the Foundation's construction disbursement records, 2022 to present. Several completed shelter projects reported in the Q3 and Q4. 2022 to 2023 reports do not correspond to actual constructions. Physical verification is recommended at the following addresses." Below that were 4 addresses, 2 in Charleston, 1 in Columbia, 1 in Savannah. Victoria read the page twice. Then she read it a third time, more slowly. She looked at the USB drive for a long moment. Then she set it aside, picked up her phone, and called Sarah Chen. "I need you to look at something," she said. Sarah came to the office within the hour. She brought a laptop that was not connected to the Foundation's network and plugged in the USB drive and opened the files in silence while Victoria stood at the window looking at King Street below. The silence lasted 11 minutes. "Victoria," Sarah said, and something in her voice made Victoria turn around. "You need to look at this." She looked. The files were financial records, formatted clearly, annotated, the kind of documentation that didn't suggest an amateur. Transaction chains, vendor registrations, account numbers, photographs of the property addresses with timestamps. The photographs showed empty lots and fields, and in one case, what appeared to be an operational car dealership where a completed children's shelter was supposed to be. Victoria sat down. She didn't speak. Sarah set the laptop on the desk in front of her and didn't speak either, which was the correct thing to do and was something Victoria had always appreciated about Sarah. She understood the difference between a moment that needed filling and a moment that needed to be left alone. After a while, Victoria said, "How long has this been happening?" "If the documentation is accurate, and I want to be clear that we need independent verification before we treat any of this as confirmed, the earliest transaction flagged here is from 2022. 2 years. Victoria looked at the screen. More than 2 years. Victoria, don't. She said it without heat, but with a clarity that cut through whatever Sarah had been about to say. I need a minute. She stood up, walked to the window, looked at the city. It was a gray morning, the sky the color of old pewter, the kind of day that made everything look slightly more tired than it actually was. She put her hand flat against the glass and felt the cold of it against her palm. She thought about Richard. 4 years of working side by side with him. The way he finished her sentences sometimes during board meetings, The way he had handled the Harrington donor crisis 2 years ago with a precision that had genuinely impressed her. The birthday card he'd sent when she'd turned 30, handwritten, 3 specific things about the foundation's work she was most proud of. She had kept the card. She thought about the women and children in the shelters. She thought about the ones in the shelters that apparently didn't exist, the money that had been allocated to build them, the reports she had signed off on, the donors who had given to programs that had never been built. "I need to verify the addresses myself," she said. Sarah looked up sharply. "Victoria, if this is what it appears to be, you should not be—" "I'm going to drive to these addresses and see what's there." She turned from the window. "Alone. Today. Before I do anything else, before I call anyone else, before I take any action that I can't take back, I need to see with my own eyes." Sarah set the laptop down and looked at her with the expression she used when she thought a client was about to do something that was legally inadvisable but humanly understandable, and the distinction between those two things was complicated. "Will you at least call me when you get there? Each one?" "Yes." "And you won't confront anyone?" "I'm driving to look at empty fields," Victoria said. "There's nobody to confront." She left the office at 10:15, told her assistant she had a personal appointment, got in her car, a dark blue sedan that she drove herself, always, because she had a specific allergy to being driven anywhere by anyone, a holdover from a childhood of being managed, and pulled up the first address on her phone. The first address was in North Charleston, 23 minutes from downtown on a Tuesday morning with light traffic. She pulled onto the street and slowed down and found the address and sat in her car with the engine running and looked at what was there. An empty field. Not derelict, not abandoned, just empty. Scrub grass and a couple of discarded construction barriers pushed to one side, like something had been started and stopped, or like something had been planned and never started at all. The kind of field that said nothing had happened here recently. She picked up her phone, called Sarah, said, "First address, empty field." Her voice was flat and steady because she was making it flat and steady. "Okay," Sarah said quietly, "drive to the next one." She drove to the next one. It was 40 minutes away, toward the city of Goose Creek. The address corresponded to a completed shelter in the foundation's records. Construction signed off 14 months ago, capacity for 32 residents, annual operating costs underwritten by a multi-year donor commitment. It was a parking lot for a commercial warehouse. She called Sarah again. Didn't say anything for a moment. "Victoria," Sarah's voice was careful, "come back to the office. The third address is in Columbia. That's 2 hours away. I know how far Columbia is. Victoria, you've seen enough." She looked at the parking lot. A truck was pulling in, the driver not noticing or not caring about the woman sitting in the blue sedan at the entrance. "How many people trusted me to do this right?" she said. It wasn't really a question for Sarah. How many people gave money because they trusted me and I told them I was running this well? "You can't know what you didn't know," Sarah said. "Maybe." She put the car in reverse. "I'm not going to Columbia." A pause. "But I'm not coming back to the office either. Not yet." She drove for a while without a destination. Through downtown, across the bridge, out toward Sullivan's Island, and back. It was the kind of driving that wasn't about getting anywhere, but about having something to do with the physical fact of being in a body that didn't know what to do with what she'd just seen. She had trusted the wrong person. That was the simple version. The more complicated version was that she had trusted the right person for 4 years, or had thought she was trusting the right person, had had no reason she could identify then to think otherwise. And the version of Richard that had earned her trust was real enough that she couldn't simply disavow having trusted him without disavowing her own judgment in a way that would make it impossible to trust anything again. She parked near the waterfront eventually, sat for a while watching the harbor. There was a boat moving slowly out through the channel. A fishing charter, she thought, medium-sized, the kind of operation that ran daily trips during the season. Someone was on the deck working on something mechanical near the stern. She wasn't thinking about the boat. She was thinking about what Richard had said at the staff meeting 2 weeks ago. This is going to be our strongest year. The way he'd said it, with what had looked and felt like genuine investment, genuine pride. She had been in that meeting. She had nodded. She had felt, briefly, the same pride. She needed to understand what she was going to do in the next 7 days. The gala was in 7 days. 7 days. She picked up her phone and called a number she'd never called before, pulled from the file Sarah had put together 2 weeks ago, the forensic accounting firm. A man named Robert Hadley answered on the second ring. "My name is Victoria Kensington," she said. "My attorney sent you a preliminary inquiry 2 weeks ago. I need to formally engage your services as of today." "Of course," said Robert Hadley. "Can you tell me the scope of what you need?" "Everything," she said. "All of it. As fast as you can possibly do it." She drove back to downtown, went to Sarah's office instead of her own, spent 3 hours with Sarah and Robert Hadley on a conference call, laying out what she knew and what she suspected and what she needed confirmed before the gala. At no point did she call Richard. At no point did she tell anyone on her staff what she was doing. She went home that evening and sat in her kitchen, not the penthouse office, the actual kitchen of her apartment where she cooked when she cooked and ate alone most nights and occasionally left dishes in the sink longer than she should, and she made herself eat something she didn't taste and thought about the 240 children in the shelter she had built and the ones that didn't exist and what she owed to both groups. The answer, when she found it, was simple enough. Protect what was real. Fix what was broken. Don't let the thing she'd spent 9 years building come apart because one man had decided that it served his purposes better as a machine to steal from than as an organization that actually helped people. She was angry. Not the clean, hot anger that passed quickly, but the cold and settled kind that moved through her like a current. Quiet, constant, requiring management. She'd had this anger before. She knew how to use it. She went to bed at 10:30 and slept 4 hours and woke up before the alarm and was back in her office by 6. The gala was in 6 days. Ethan found out about the anonymous package from Marcus, who found out from Sandra Reyes, who had, through the kind of interagency coordination that happened when multiple parties were independently building a case around the same target, been made aware that the Foundation's director had received documentation and appeared to be taking steps to verify it. She went to the property addresses herself, Marcus said. According to Sandra's contact at the county level, there's a record of her car at 2 of them. Ethan processed this. He was at the marina early morning before the day's work had started. The harbor was still in the particular stillness of 6:15 a.m., the light low and golden across the water. Who sent her the package? Sandra doesn't know. I don't know. It wasn't us. Emily? She says no, and I believe her. It would have been too much risk. She would have told us. Ethan was quiet. Somebody else had known enough to pull that package together and deliver it. He ran through the possibilities quickly and landed on one that fit. Someone inside the Foundation, not Emily, who had noticed something and had chosen this method instead of going to Richard or to the board. Janet Marsh, maybe. The senior accountant who had left suddenly and hadn't returned Emily's calls. Someone who had enough information to be dangerous and enough fear to be anonymous about it. Does it matter? He said finally. Not to the case, Marcus said. It might matter to how Victoria Kensington moves from here. How so? If she's already verifying the property addresses, she's either going to go to law enforcement or go to Richard. If she goes to Richard before Sandra's team is ready, he disappears. Ethan said it flatly. He takes whatever he can move quickly, and he's gone. Right. We need to get ahead of her. Ethan looked at the water. She needs to know that law enforcement is already involved, that the worst thing she can do right now is tip Richard off. How are we getting ahead of her? We don't know her. We've never met her. She doesn't know the Harbor Light Fund has a face. Ethan didn't answer for a moment. She will by the end of today, he said. Marcus made a sound that conveyed a complicated mixture of admiration and concern. You're going to go see her. I'm going to go see her. Ethan, she doesn't know who you are. You're going to walk into... I donated $22 million to her foundation over 5 years, Ethan said. I think that earns me a conversation. There was a brief silence. I can't argue with that math, Marcus said. He didn't go directly to Victoria's office. He called first, Sarah Chen's number, which he'd found through a combination of the Foundation's legal filing records and a business directory, because he wasn't going to walk in cold to a woman who was already operating with a very specific kind of vigilance. Sarah Chen answered on the third ring. Her voice was professional and cautious, which was the correct voice to have when a number you didn't recognize called with no identification. "My name is Ethan Walker," he said. "I'm the Harbor Light Fund. I need to speak with Victoria Kensington today. It's urgent, it concerns the financial situation she's currently investigating, and I need you to understand that I'm not the problem. I may be part of the solution." A pause. "Please tell her that and ask if she'll see me." A silence that lasted several seconds. "How do I know what you're describing is accurate?" "You don't. But the name Harbor Light will mean something to her. Ask her." He waited. "I'll hold." He held for 4 minutes. Then Sarah came back. Her voice was different, still professional, but the kind of careful professional that meant she was recalibrating. "Ms. Kensington will see you at 2 o'clock, she said. "Our office, not the foundation." "That works?" "Mr. Walker, whatever you're bringing to this meeting, if you're bringing it to destabilize or damage the foundation in any way. I've been trying to protect the foundation for 6 weeks, he said, and funding it for 5 years. I'll be there at 2. He spent the rest of the morning at the marina. He told Frank he needed to leave at 1, which Frank acknowledged with a nod and no questions, which was one of several things Ethan valued about Frank Calloway. He changed in the marina's back office. He kept a clean shirt there for reasons he'd never explained to anyone, and drove downtown. Sarah Chen's office was on the 14th floor of a building on Broad Street, the kind of office that served its purpose without making a statement. Sarah herself was in her mid-40s, trim and precise, with the kind of face that had learned to give very little away. She met him in the reception area, looked at him, the clean shirt, the work pants that were as clean as work pants got, the hands that were going to have grease in the knuckles regardless of how thoroughly he scrubbed them, because that was simply the condition of his hands now. She looked at all of this and made whatever assessment she made and said, "This way." Victoria Kensington was standing when he came in, not sitting. She was by the window on the far side of the conference room, and she turned when he entered, and they looked at each other for a moment. She was younger than photographs conveyed, or younger seeming, maybe, though the tiredness around her eyes told a different story. She was wearing a charcoal blazer and dark slacks, her hair pulled back simply, and she looked like someone who had slept about as well as he had, which was to say, not very. "Mr. Walker," she said. "Sit down." He sat. She stayed standing for a moment longer, then came and sat across from him. Sarah took a seat at the end of the table with a yellow legal pad. "You're the Harbor Light Fund," Victoria said. "Yes." She looked at him for a moment. He let her look. 5 years, she said, "and you never—" "I didn't want recognition," he said. "The work was what mattered." "What work? Our work?" "Your organization's work." He held her gaze. "Which is why I'm here, because I've spent 6 weeks investigating what Richard Mercer has been doing with the money your donors have given, and I believe I know what he's planning to do at the gala. And I think you may already know part of this, which is why I'm sitting in front of you 4 days before— 6 days, she said. 6 days before the event that I believe he intends to use as the final mechanism of a fraud that has, by my count, already diverted more than $15 million from your organization." Silence. Sarah's pen was still. Victoria looked at him with the expression of someone who has already arrived at a destination by a different road and is processing the fact of encountering someone else there. "How long have you known?" she said. "I started noticing discrepancies 6 weeks ago. I've been building documentation since then." "You should have told me sooner." "I didn't have enough to tell you, and I wasn't sure what you knew." He said it without apology. "Now I have enough. And you verified the property addresses, which tells me you're already past denial. So I'd rather spend the next 10 minutes telling you what I know than explaining why I waited." Something moved across her face. It might have been irritation. It might have been respect. It was probably both. "Talk," she said. He told her everything. The shell company structure, the Meridian Capital Partners setup, the email metadata Danny had traced, the package Marcus had submitted to the SEC. He told her about Sandra Reyes and the federal agents and the timeline, that law enforcement was already in motion, and that the single most important thing Victoria could do in the next 6 days was not alert Richard that anything had changed. He has to believe the gala is proceeding normally, Ethan said. If he thinks anyone knows, if he senses anything is off, he moves early. He probably has an exit plan that doesn't require waiting for the gala proceeds. The gala is the ideal scenario for him, not the only one. Victoria was quiet through most of this. She asked 2 questions, both specific. The name of Sandra Reyes's team at the SEC, which she wrote down, and the nature of the Meridian Capital Partnership announcement, what exactly Richard was planning to say, and how the mechanism was supposed to work. Ethan told her what Emily had described from the draft press release. He sent that draft to the board communications committee last week, Victoria said. I approved it. She said it with a flatness that told him exactly how she felt about having approved it. I thought it was a reasonable expansion of the investment framework. The numbers he presented made sense. Of course they did, Ethan said. He's been doing this for 2 years. He knows how to make things make sense. She looked at the table, then at him. What do you need from me? I need you to hold the gala. She stared at him. You want me to proceed with the gala, with Richard, with the Meridian announcement. I need him confident and in that room. The moment he leaves Charleston with access to those funds is the moment this becomes exponentially harder to resolve cleanly. In that room, in front of witnesses, with federal agents present, it ends. He met her eyes. I know what I'm asking. I know what it costs. A long silence. Victoria Kensington looked at her hands, then out the window, then back at him. You funded this foundation for 5 years, she said, anonymously. Why? He'd known the question was coming. He'd thought about how to answer it. My wife wanted to do this kind of work, he said. She died before she could. I had the means. It seemed like the obvious thing. Victoria looked at him. Something shifted in her face, not quite softening, but opening. What did she do? She was an ER nurse. He paused. She saw a lot of kids come through without anywhere safe to go after. It bothered her. Silence. I'm sorry, Victoria said. Not a perfunctory sorry, the kind that had actual weight. It was 4 years ago, he said, which was not the same as saying he was over it, and they both understood that. Sarah hadn't moved. Her pen was still on the legal pad. Victoria stood up and went to the window. She stood with her arms crossed, looking at Broad Street below. Ethan waited. The gala has 218 confirmed guests, she said. Board members, major donors, media, people who have trusted this organization for years. She paused. If I hold it and this goes wrong, it won't go wrong. You can't guarantee that. No, he said. I can't. But I can tell you what I know about how these things work when they go right. The federal agents will be there. Sandra Reyes's team will have the Meridian accounts frozen before the gala begins. When Richard makes the announcement, there's nowhere for the money to go. The mechanism fails in real time. He stopped. And everyone in that room will know exactly who built the fraud and who uncovered it. She turned from the window. Is that the part that matters to you? Everyone knowing? No, he said simply. The part that matters to me is that 240 kids still have somewhere to sleep next week. She held his gaze for a long moment. The kind of moment where you were deciding whether you trusted someone and you knew that it was a decision, not a calculation. That there was a point past which the logic ran out and what remained was judgment. Okay, she said. We hold the gala. He nodded. But I need to know what role you're playing, she said. You said everyone will know. That means, I'll be there, he said. If you want me there. She looked at him with an expression he couldn't fully read. My anonymous donor, she said quietly, the mechanic from the waterfront. She wasn't mocking him. She was working through something, some reconfiguration of a narrative she'd been carrying about her own organization and where its foundation actually rested. I fix boats, he said. It's good work. Despite everything, despite the weight in her eyes and the exhaustion and the anger she was managing, something shifted briefly at the corner of her mouth. Not quite a smile. The shadow of one. I need to talk to Sandra Reyes directly, she said. I'll get you the number. He gave her Marcus's cell instead, with Marcus's permission. Because Marcus was the chain of contact and it was cleaner. Victoria walked him to the door herself, which Sarah seemed to note with a slight adjustment of expression. At the door, she stopped him. "Mr. Walker." He turned. "When this is over, however it goes, I want to sit down properly, not like this. I want to understand who you are and why you made the choices you made." She paused. "Not for the foundation. For me." He thought about that. "That's fair," he said. He took the elevator down and walked out onto Broad Street into the gray afternoon. His truck was parked 2 blocks away. He walked to it without hurrying. He called Emily when he was back in the truck. She answered on the second ring. "It's moving," he said. "She's on board. The gala holds." A silence. He could hear Emily breathing on the other end. "Is she okay?" Emily said. "No," he said honestly. "But she will be." Another silence. "Ethan, what if something goes wrong at the gala? What if Richard figures it out early? What if the account freeze doesn't hold, or the agents aren't in position, or—" "Emily, I know. One thing at a time." "One thing at a time," he said. "Right now the thing is 6 days." He hung up and sat in the truck for a moment. Then he started the engine and drove back to the marina, because Frank had left him a voicemail about the motor yacht, and the propeller shafts were apparently a bigger problem than either of them had initially assessed. That evening, Lily told him at dinner that her class had started a new project, a mural for the school hallway, each student contributing a panel. She'd decided to paint the harbor, which she told him with the slightly defiant confidence of someone who had made a decision and was prepared to defend it. "Why the harbor?" he asked. "Because it's where you work," she said, "and because it looks different every time you look at it. Miss Chen said we should pick something that changes." He looked at her across the dinner table. 8 years old with her mother's eyes and her own particular gravity. "That's a good reason," he said. She seemed satisfied with that. She went back to her food. He sat with the ordinary specific weight of that moment. His daughter and dinner and the kitchen and 6 days until everything he'd spent 6 weeks building would either hold or it wouldn't, and the harbor outside the window looking exactly the same as it always did. That was the thing about the world. It kept being ordinary even when everything underneath it wasn't. He washed the dishes, helped Lily pick her clothes for the next day, read with her for 20 minutes, tucked her in. Went back to the kitchen table. 5.5 days. The documents on his laptop were the same as they'd been for weeks. He went through them again anyway, looking for what he might have missed, the angle he hadn't checked, the piece that would make the whole structure more solid. He found 2 things he hadn't fully cross-referenced, and spent an hour on them, and they held. The structure held. He closed the laptop at midnight and went to bed and did not sleep well, which was fine. Sleep was not the thing that was going to get this done. He lay in the dark and listened to the house, and thought about an empty field in North Charleston that was supposed to have walls and a roof and children inside it. That was enough. The Marquette Hotel had been on the corner of Meeting and Wentworth since 1923, and in that time it had hosted governors, weddings, at least one minor scandal involving a state senator that nobody talked about openly anymore, and approximately 40 years' worth of charity galas for organizations whose causes ranged from genuinely important to aggressively decorative. The ballroom on the second floor could seat 300. Tonight it would seat 218, plus catering staff, plus the 6 people who were not on the guest list and were not carrying trays. Sandra Reyes had flown in from Atlanta that afternoon. She was 51 years old, compact and precise, with close-cropped gray hair and the particular stillness of someone who had spent decades in rooms where things were about to happen and had learned that stillness was its own kind of preparation. She'd met with Ethan and Marcus in a conference room at a law firm on Church Street at 3 p.m., 2 hours before the gala doors opened. "The Meridian accounts were frozen at noon today," she said, without introduction, sitting down and opening a slim folder. "All 4 destination accounts. The freeze is through a federal court order. It looks like a routine regulatory hold from the outside, nothing that would flag to someone watching. If Mercer checks, which he likely will, he'll see a processing delay, not a freeze." "How long before he realizes it's more than a delay?" Marcus said. "Depends on how carefully he's monitoring, but the transfer won't clear regardless. Whatever he announces tonight, the money has nowhere to go." Ethan sat across from her with his hands flat on the table. He was wearing the black suit, the only suit he owned, bought 3 years ago for a friend's wedding and worn twice since. It fit adequately. What about the agents inside the room? 4 plainclothes. 2 will be working the event as catering contractors. The hotel has been cooperating since this morning. 2 will be in the room as guests using identities that match legitimately registered attendees who've agreed to let us use their seats. Sandra looked at him steadily. The arrest will happen inside the ballroom, after the announcement. We need the Meridian Declaration on record, him stating publicly the nature of the fund and his authority over it. That's the cleanest piece of evidence for the fraud charge. So we let him make the announcement, Ethan said. We let him make the announcement, Sandra confirmed. Then we move. Marcus was looking at the folder. What's the exposure window? Between the announcement and when your people move, how long is he unsecured? Less than 90 seconds from the moment he finishes speaking. Ethan thought about 90 seconds. 90 seconds was a long time if you were in it and knew what was coming. There's one more thing, Sandra said. She looked at Ethan. Ms. Kensington has requested that she be the one to present the forensic audit findings to the room before the arrest. A pause. I want your read on whether that's a problem. He thought about Victoria, the way she'd stood at the window in Sarah Chen's office, the specific quality of the anger she was managing. It's not a problem, he said. It's necessary. Sandra nodded once. Then we're coordinated. She closed the folder. Mr. Walker, when this is over, my office is going to want a full deposition about the Harbor Light Fund, the documentation process, everything you've built over the past 6 weeks. That's going to be time-consuming and probably not pleasant. I know. And your name will be part of the public record of this case. I know that too. She held his gaze for a moment with the expression of someone who was used to people saying they understood things and then being surprised when those things actually happened. He seemed to pass whatever assessment she was running because she nodded again and stood up. 7 p.m., she said. Don't be late. He wasn't late. He arrived at the Marquette at 6:50 and stood for a moment on the sidewalk outside the hotel's entrance, looking up at the facade. The stone was the particular warm gold of old Charleston buildings at dusk, the streetlights just beginning to compete with the last of the daylight. Valets were managing a steady stream of arriving guests, the kind of cars that cost more than some houses, the kind of clothes that required specific decisions. Music floated from somewhere inside, something orchestral and tasteful. He had left Lily with Marcus's wife, Deshauna, whom Lily adored and who had 3 kids of her own, and had told Ethan without being asked that she'd keep Lily overnight if the evening ran long. He had hugged Lily goodbye in Deshauna's front hallway, and she had hugged him back with the particular fierceness she deployed sometimes without warning, and then immediately returned to the living room where Deshauna's youngest was showing her a game on a tablet. He walked into the hotel. The lobby was marble floors and high ceilings and arrangements of white flowers on every surface, all of it suggesting a level of resource expenditure that Ethan processed without judgment. He found the registration table, gave his name to a young woman in a black dress who ran her finger down the list, and found him and gave him a name tag. He took the name tag, looked at it for a moment, and put it in his jacket pocket. He found a position near the edge of the room, not hiding exactly, but not in the flow of traffic either. He watched the room fill. He identified 2 of the plainclothes agents within the first 10 minutes, which he noted without doing anything about it. He watched Richard Mercer arrive at 7:12, moving through the room with the ease of someone who had been to hundreds of events like this and had stopped finding them effortful. Richard looked well. That was the only word for it. He was wearing a dark charcoal suit, and he'd had a recent haircut, and he moved through the crowd dispensing handshakes and the specific warm attention of a man in complete command of his professional life. He laughed at something Harold Whitmore said. He put his hand briefly on the arm of a woman Ethan recognized from the Foundation's board. He looked, in every observable way, like a man who expected tonight to be a very good night. Ethan watched him and felt nothing in particular. This was one of the things he'd noticed about himself over the years, that he didn't generate the kind of heat toward people who had done wrong things that some people seemed to expect. What he felt was more like weather, a front moving in, something that was going to change the conditions, whether anyone was ready for it or not. Victoria arrived at 7:20. She came in with Sarah Chen and two members of the foundation's board, and she was wearing a deep burgundy dress that was simple in the way that things worn by people with genuine taste were simple. Nothing decorative, nothing unnecessary. She looked composed in the way that Ethan had come to understand was her default register under pressure. Not calm exactly, but controlled. The composure of someone who had decided something and was now executing on it. She found him across the room within 30 seconds of entering. Their eyes met briefly. She gave him nothing visible. No nod, no acknowledgement. She turned to her board members and smiled and said something that made them laugh. And then she moved into the room with the practiced ease of someone who had been running events like this for 9 years. He understood what she was doing. She was being Victoria Kensington, Foundation Director, host of the Harbor Legacy Gala. She was being it completely, without gaps, because any gap was a signal to Richard, and a signal to Richard was a door swinging open that they needed to keep closed for approximately 2 more hours. She was doing it well. He thought, not for the first time, that she was better at this than she probably gave herself credit for. The cocktail hour moved the way cocktail hours always moved, slowly for the people who were working and quickly for the people who were drinking. Ethan stayed near the periphery and nursed a club soda and watched the geometry of the room. At one point, Richard moved within 15 feet of him, and Ethan tracked him without turning his head, watching in his peripheral vision as Richard stopped to speak with two men he didn't recognize. Younger, in their mid-30s, slightly uncomfortable in their formal wear. He pulled out his phone and took a slow pan of the room like someone checking their messages. He sent the screenshot to Marcus, who was outside in a car with a direct line to Sandra's team. The message back came in 40 seconds. Second one on the left matches a name from the Meridian LLC filing. Stay put. Ethan put his phone away. The two men with Richard were involved in the fraud. Secondary. Facilitators, not architects, but involved. Sandra's team was already running the identification. Richard moved away from them 5 minutes later, smooth and unhurried, and rejoined the main flow of the cocktail hour. He stopped near the bar and picked up a glass of wine and surveyed the room with the satisfaction of a man looking at something he had built. At 8:15, the ballroom doors opened and guests moved inside. The ballroom was what it always was at these events, beautiful in the specific way that money applied to a space made it beautiful, with round tables dressed in white linen and floral centerpieces and lighting that had been designed to make everyone look slightly better than they actually did. A small stage at the far end held a podium and a screen that was currently showing a slide of the Foundation's logo. String quartet in the corner, playing things that didn't require attention. Ethan found his seat, a table near the right side of the room, not prominently placed, the kind of seating that said the event coordinator had put him somewhere functional rather than symbolic. He was seated with a couple from Mount Pleasant he didn't know, and a woman who worked in the Foundation's communications department who introduced herself as Diane and then turned to talk to the couple, which was fine. He looked at the room. 218 people plus the people who weren't on the guest list. The screen at the front. The stage where Richard would stand in approximately 45 minutes and announce the Meridian Capital Partners Initiative to a room full of people who had no idea what that announcement actually meant. His phone vibrated. Marcus. Sandra's team is in position. All 4 agents confirmed. Meridian account still frozen. We're good. He put the phone away. Dinner was served. He ate part of it without tasting it, which was not a reflection on the kitchen. He talked briefly to the couple from Mount Pleasant when they addressed him directly, answering questions about what he did with the short version that had been accurate since the Whitmore reception. He worked on boats at the harbor. The woman, Carol, he thought she said that sounded like wonderful work, the kind of thing where you could see the results. He said yes, that was true. He watched Richard at the head table near the stage. Richard ate with appetite and talked with easy confidence and refilled his wine glass once, and at no point looked like a man under any pressure whatsoever. Either he was an extraordinarily effective actor, or he genuinely had no idea that the evening was not going to go the way he had planned it. Ethan thought it was probably both. The best con artists believed their own story right up until they didn't. At 9:15, Victoria took the stage. The room settled as she walked up. The gradual quieting of 200 people returning from their private conversations to the collective attention of the event. She stood at the podium for a moment before she spoke, and in that moment, Ethan watched her face and saw what was underneath the composure. In the fraction of a second before she brought it fully under control, not fear, something colder and more purposeful. "Good evening," she said. Her voice was clear and carried without effort. "And thank you, all of you." She looked out at the room. 9 years ago, I stood in an empty office on King Street with a business plan and a conviction that we could build something that actually helped people in this city and in this state. What we've built since then, the shelters, the programs, the lives that have changed, none of it exists without the people in this room. I mean that. Not as a formality. I mean it concretely and specifically. She paused. Tonight I want to talk about what this foundation actually is. Not the numbers, though the numbers matter, but what it is. Because I think sometimes organizations like ours can start to exist at a distance from the actual work. We build the infrastructure, we grow the budget, we expand the programs, and sometimes in all of that growth, we lose sight of what any of it is actually for. Ethan watched Richard at the head table. Richard was listening with an expression of engaged approval, the face of a man hearing exactly what he expected to hear from a speech he had probably reviewed in draft form. Victoria talked for 8 minutes. She talked about specific families, Teet, not by name, but in enough detail that the specificity was real, who had come through the foundation's shelters. She talked about what those shelters were, and what they were not, and what it took to keep them running. She was a good speaker. She had the particular skill of making a large room feel like a conversation, and she used it. She did not talk about Richard. She did not talk about Meridian Capital Partners. She was doing exactly what she had told Ethan she would do, holding the room, holding the evening, holding the performance of normality for exactly as long as it needed to hold. When she finished, the applause was genuine and sustained. She stepped back from the podium and looked toward the wings of the stage where Richard was already moving forward. And in the instant before he reached her, she looked across the room and found Ethan's table, and their eyes met for exactly 2 seconds. He gave her a single small nod. She turned and smiled at Richard as he passed her, and he touched her arm briefly, the collegial warmth of 2 people who had worked together for 4 years, and stepped up to the podium. The room was still warm from Victoria's speech, leaning in, receptive. Richard understood how to use that. He let the warmth settle for a beat before he spoke. "Victoria doesn't like to be praised," he said with the tone of fond exasperation. "So I'm going to do it quickly. What she has built is remarkable. And the reason we're all here tonight is because remarkable things deserve remarkable support." A murmur of agreement. Someone near the back applauded briefly. Ethan set his phone face down on the table without looking at it. Richard moved through the first part of his remarks the way he moved through everything, competently, warmly, with the precise deployment of specifics that created the impression of deep knowledge. He talked about the foundation's annual results. He named donors and projects. He mentioned the new family transitional housing program in Colombia, which was real. And he mentioned the expanded shelter capacity in the Low Country, which was real. And he talked about what the next year could look like if Tonight produced the kind of support that previous galas had generated. Then he paused. A deliberate pause, the kind that signaled a pivot to something significant. "I want to share something with you tonight that I'm genuinely excited about," he said. "The foundation has been working for the past several months to establish a new investment framework, a way to grow the endowment intelligently, to ensure that the resources you give us tonight continue to generate impact for years, not just months." He looked out at the room with the expression of a man presenting a gift. "In partnership with Meridian Capital Partners, we're establishing a dedicated endowment fund that will allow us to—" "Richard!" The voice was Victoria's. She had walked back onto the stage. She was standing to his left, and the room went very quiet in the specific way it goes quiet when something unexpected happens in a place where the social contract requires predictability. Richard turned. His expression shifted by only a fraction, a small tightening around the eyes that lasted less than a second before the warmth came back, slightly more deliberate than before. "Victoria." "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said, and she didn't sound sorry. She sounded like someone being precise about what they were doing and why. "I need to share something with our guests first, before the Meridian announcement." She turned to face the room. Richard stayed where he was. Ethan watched his hands, both of them on the podium, not gripping, just resting, maintaining the pose. "This foundation has been built by your generosity," Victoria said, "by your trust. And I believe that trust obligates me to absolute honesty with you, even when that honesty is painful." She paused. "Particularly when?" She nodded to someone off stage. The screen behind the podium changed. Where the foundation's logo had been, there was now a set of financial documents. Transaction records, formatted clearly, with columns that were legible from across the room. Several people in the audience leaned forward. Ethan heard the couple from Mount Pleasant make a quiet sound of confusion. Over the past 6 weeks, a comprehensive forensic audit was conducted of the Foundation's construction disbursement records for the period 2022 to present, Victoria said. Her voice was steady in a way that must have cost her something. What that audit found was evidence of systematic financial fraud. The deliberate misappropriation of donor funds through a network of fraudulent construction vendors and shell companies totaling, by current documentation, more than $15 million. The room did not explode. It did the opposite. It compressed, went very still, the way a room does when people are absorbing something and haven't yet decided what to do with it. Richard's hands were no longer resting on the podium. "The audit traces every fraudulent transaction through a consistent approval chain," Victoria continued. "Every disbursement to every non-existent vendor bears the same authorization signature." She looked at the screen, then at the room, and not at Richard. "The Meridian Capital Partners initiative that you just heard referenced was the final mechanism of this fraud. A vehicle designed to transfer Gala proceeds to accounts controlled by the same individual responsible for the prior theft." Someone in the room said something, quietly, to someone else. A chair scraped. Richard had stepped back from the podium. Not running, just no longer holding the position he'd held, the subtle geometry of someone whose posture had shifted from controlling a space to calculating what was available to them. "The Foundation has cooperated fully with federal authorities," Victoria said. "Those authorities are present tonight." And there it was. Ethan watched the room process the second piece of information and watched Richard's face process it simultaneously, watched the moment where the performance broke. Not dramatically, not the way it happened in films where the mask fell in a single instant. It was slower than that. The warmth drained first, then the confidence, and what was left was something that looked briefly naked and then quickly rearranged into something else. Calculation. Richard stepped to the edge of the stage. He looked out at the room with an expression that was attempting to be composed and wasn't quite making it. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," he began. "Mr. Mercer." The voice came from Ethan's right. One of the plainclothes agents, a man in a dark suit who had been sitting 2 tables over, was on his feet, moving toward the stage with a second agent alongside him. The 2 catering staff agents were moving from the room's periphery. "I'm Special Agent Daniel Park, Securities and Exchange Commission. Richard Mercer, you're under arrest for wire fraud, securities fraud, and misappropriation of charitable funds." The next 30 seconds were not tidy. They never were, regardless of how much was planned in advance. Richard said something, not words exactly, more the sound of someone whose thought process had collapsed mid-sentence. He moved left and found an agent there. He looked at the room, 200 people staring at him in a silence so complete that Ethan could hear the string quartet awkwardly stopping mid-phrase in the corner. Then his composure came back briefly in the specific form of a man trying to salvage something from an unsalvageable moment. He straightened, pulled at his jacket cuff. "I'd like to speak with my attorney," he said. "You'll have that opportunity," Agent Park said. "Please come with me." Richard Mercer walked off the stage of the Harbor Legacy Gala between 2 federal agents, and the room watched him go in silence, and he kept his chin level the whole way across the floor to the doors, which Ethan thought later might have been the most honest thing about him. That even at the end, the performance was what he reached for. The doors closed behind him. The silence lasted another 5 seconds. Then it broke into what 200 people simultaneously deciding to speak sounded like, which was a great deal of noise. Ethan sat where he was. Victoria stood at the center of the stage. She looked out at the room, the noise and the movement and the shock working its way through 200 people. And she was very still, just for a moment. The stillness of someone who had done the thing they set out to do and hadn't yet decided what to do with the aftermath. Then she stepped back to the podium. "I know," she said, and the room gradually quieted again. "I know this isn't what you came here for tonight." She waited until she had most of the room's attention. "But I need to tell you what's true, and what's true is this. The fraud that happened inside this foundation did not hollow it out. The shelters that exist are real. The programs that function are functioning. The people we serve are still being served." Her voice was steady. "What was stolen from us? From all of us. From the children this organization exists for, will be recovered through the legal process that has already begun, and the foundation will continue." A man near the front, Ethan recognized him as one of the foundation's oldest major donors. A man named Garrett, who had been giving for 7 years, stood up. "What do you need from us?" he said. "Just that." Victoria looked at him. "I need you to stay," she said. "I need you to believe that what we built is worth rebuilding, and I need you to keep trusting us enough to let us prove that." The room was quiet in a different way than before, a quieter kind of quiet. Garrett sat back down, picked up his checkbook. Someone else started to applaud. It spread unevenly, haltingly. Not the automatic applause of a formal event, but something more deliberate, people choosing it. Not everyone joined. Some people were already on their phones, already composing messages or calls to lawyers or to tomorrow's news editors. That was going to happen, and there was nothing to be done about it. But enough people stayed. Victoria stepped down from the stage. She made her way through the room, speaking to board members, to long-term donors, to people who grabbed her arm and said things she answered with the steadiness she'd been maintaining all evening. She was doing the necessary work of holding the organization together in real time, in the room, and she was doing it without faltering. Ethan stayed at his table for a while. The couple from Mount Pleasant had both taken out their phones. Diane from communications had disappeared into what was clearly a crisis management conversation near the back of the room. The dinner plates were still on the tables, half-eaten. Marcus texted him. "Outside. How are you doing?" He thought about that question for a moment. Then he typed back, "Fine. Give me 10 minutes." He looked at the stage, empty now, the screen still showing the financial documents, which someone would need to turn off at some point. He looked at the room, the controlled chaos of it, the way people were sorting themselves into those who were going to be okay with this and those who weren't. He thought about the night he'd sat at his kitchen table and first noticed the discrepancy in the North Charleston disbursement line. 6 weeks ago, by himself, with a cup of coffee that went cold while he stared at a number that didn't add up. "Mr. Walker." He turned. Victoria was standing at the edge of his table. She looked, for the first time since he'd met her, like someone who had been running very hard and had stopped. "It held," he said. She sat down across from him without asking. The couple from Mount Pleasant had vacated their seats at some point in the past 10 minutes. She set her hands on the table and looked at them for a moment. "Garrett is pledging double his usual contribution," she said. "He's already texted 2 other donors." "Good. The board is convening an emergency session tomorrow morning." She looked up at him. "I'll be asking for a vote on new financial oversight protocols. Full transparency on every transaction over $10,000. External review board for disbursements." "That's the right call." She was quiet for a moment. Around them, the room continued its complicated processing. "I wanted to tell you something," she said, "before tonight gets too far into logistics." "Okay." "When I walked into Sarah's conference room and saw you sitting there, work pants, your hands, the whole thing," she paused, a small gesture that might have been self-deprecating. "I assumed something that I shouldn't have assumed about what kind of person was sitting in front of me." He waited. "I want to apologize for that," she said. "Not because it changed anything. You handled it fine and you clearly didn't need my instant approval, but because it was wrong. And I'm trying to be honest tonight about things that were wrong." He looked at her. "People make those assumptions. It's not worth apologizing for." "I think it is," she said simply. "Because you'd been protecting something I built for 5 years, and I looked at you and filed you in the wrong place in about 30 seconds. She held his gaze. That matters. He was quiet for a moment. Apology accepted, he said, because it seemed like the honest and complete response. She nodded, looked at the room again. The press is going to be difficult, tomorrow and probably for a while. I know. They're going to want to talk to you, the anonymous donor who... I'll deal with it. She looked at him. You don't want this, do you? The visibility. He thought about how to answer that honestly. I wanted what was in those shelters to stay in those shelters, he said. The rest of it is just what comes with that. Victoria was quiet for a long moment. The string quartet, apparently having decided that music was more appropriate than silence, had begun playing again quietly in the corner. Something low and unobtrusive, leaving enough room for the conversations in the room to continue. Can I ask you something? She said. Sure. 5 years, over $20 million, through an anonymous trust. She looked at him directly. There were easier ways to donate, ways that would have gotten you recognition, tax advantages you were probably leaving on the table. I had an accountant. The tax structure was fine. That's not what I'm asking. He understood what she was asking. Claire would have done it differently, he said. She would have been here, in the work, every day. She would have known the names of the kids in the shelters and what they needed and what they liked for breakfast. He paused. I'm not built that way. I couldn't be that person. So I did what I could do. Victoria held his gaze for a moment. There was something in her expression he hadn't seen before. Not pity, nothing like that. Something more like recognition. She sounds like she was remarkable, she said quietly. She was ordinary, he said, in the best possible way. She just thought that helping people was the obvious thing to do when you could. Across the room, Agent Park had returned and was speaking quietly with 2 board members. The forensic audit documents were still on the screen at the front of the room. Someone had dimmed the light slightly, which made the documents somehow more stark. I need to go handle about 14 different things, Victoria said. She pushed back her chair and stood. Then she stopped. The board meeting tomorrow. I'd like you to be there. He looked up at her. I'm not a board member. No, but you're the person who built the case that saved this organization, and the board needs to understand where the integrity of the investigation came from and who maintained it. She held his gaze. Also, frankly, I'd like someone in that room who isn't going to tell me what they think I want to hear. He thought about the marina in the morning, the Peterson boat whose replacement parts had finally come in, Frank, who would manage without him for another day. What time? He said. 8 a.m. I'll be there. She walked away into the room, and he watched her go. The way she moved, already reconstructing, already becoming the person the next 12 hours were going to require her to be. He thought that she was going to be all right. Not easily, and not without significant cost. But all right. He sent Marcus a text. Coming out now. He stood up from the table, adjusted his jacket, and walked across the ballroom toward the doors. He passed within 5 feet of the screen still showing the financial documents, the columns of numbers that represented 2.5 years of careful, patient theft. He didn't stop to look at them. At the doors he paused and turned back. The room was still full, more full than he'd expected. People who had stayed not because the evening had gone as planned, but because they'd decided the organization was worth staying for. Victoria was at a table on the far side of the room, talking to Garrett, whose checkbook was still open in front of him. Ethan looked at the room for a moment. 200 people, the ornate ceiling, the white linen on the tables, the string quartet, a room full of people who had come tonight to do something good, and had found out that goodness was more complicated than they'd expected and had chosen, most of them, to stay with it anyway. Then he walked out. Marcus was parked half a block down Meeting Street, engine running, the windows slightly fogged. Ethan got in the passenger seat. Marcus looked at him. Well, Marcus said. Yeah, Ethan said. They sat for a moment. How'd she handle it? Marcus said. Better than anyone could have reasonably expected. And Mercer? He kept his chin up the whole way out. Ethan looked out the passenger window at the hotel entrance, where a few guests had come outside with their phones and were standing in groups, talking. I almost respected it. The commitment to the performance. Marcus made a sound. You want to get something to eat? I haven't eaten since noon. Ethan thought about it. He was hungry, as it turned out, now that the evening was over and the adrenaline was leaving the way it always left. Quietly, leaving a kind of flatness behind. Yeah, he said. Let's eat. Marcus pulled out into traffic. The Marquette Hotel receded in the side mirror, lit up and full of people, doing the complicated work of an organization that had nearly been destroyed choosing to continue. Deshauna said Lily beat all her kids at a card game and was very gracious about it, Marcus said. Ethan almost smiled. What game? Go fish. A pause. Apparently she has a system. He thought about that. His daughter in a kitchen in North Charleston with a system for Go Fish, completely unconcerned about this evening and everything it had cost and everything it had accomplished. Just playing cards and being 8 years old. She has a system for everything, he said. Marcus laughed. Outside, the city moved past the windows. The particular nighttime version of Charleston, lit up and complicated. The harbor somewhere off to the right behind the buildings. A city that didn't know what had happened tonight in the ballroom of the Marquette Hotel, and would know by morning and would have opinions about it, and would keep going either way. That was how cities worked, how everything worked. You built what you could build. You protected what needed protecting. And then the morning came and there was more to do. Ethan leaned his head back against the seat and closed his eyes for a minute and just breathed. The morning after the gala, Charleston woke up to the story. It was on the local news by 6 a.m., a brief factual report about an arrest at a charity event the previous evening. A name, a charge. By 7, it had been picked up by 2 regional outlets. By 9, a national wire service had run a version of it. And by 10, the story had acquired the particular velocity of something that combined money, fraud, and the specific betrayal of charitable trust that made people feel personally implicated even when they weren't. Ethan heard about most of this secondhand. He had picked Lily up from Deshauna's at 7:30, driven her to school, and then gone directly to the foundation's offices for the board meeting Victoria had asked him to attend. He had not checked the news. He had not looked at his phone except to text Marcus the previous night when he got home. Lily asleep, going to bed. Thanks for everything. And Marcus had sent back a single thumbs up. The board meeting was on the 3rd floor of the foundation's building, in a conference room that looked out over the small garden at the back of the property. There were 11 board members present, plus Victoria, plus Sarah Chen in her capacity as legal counsel, plus Ethan, who sat at the far end of the table and felt the 11 board members look at him and make their assessments and then look away. Victoria opened the meeting without ceremony. She laid out what had been discovered, what the legal process looked like from here, and what the foundation's operational exposure was in the near term. She was precise and did not soften anything. When she was done, she said, questions. There were many questions. They ranged from the reasonable, what was the expected timeline for asset recovery, what did the forensic audit recommend for structural changes, how were they managing the staff during the transition, to the less reasonable, which were the ones that were really about liability and reputation and board members protecting themselves. Ethan sat quietly through most of it. He answered 3 specific questions when Victoria directed them to him. How the investigation had been initiated, what the documentation chain looked like, and whether he believed there were other instances of financial irregularity that the audit hadn't yet surfaced. On the 3rd question, he said, I don't believe so, but that's the auditor's job to confirm, not mine. He paused. What I can tell you is that the structure Richard built was designed to be self-contained. He wasn't sharing this with anyone else inside the foundation. He was too careful for that. A woman named Margaret, who had been on the board for 6 years and had the particular energy of someone who processed distress through action, said, and the Harbor Light Fund. You're saying you personally funded? Yes, Ethan said. Can I ask, why would you donate that amount of money over 5 years through an anonymous vehicle, rather than… Margaret, Victoria said, not unkindly. No, it's fine, Ethan said. Because the work was what mattered, not who I was. And because I didn't want the foundation making decisions based on the preferences of a donor rather than the needs of the people it serves. He held Margaret's gaze. If you know who's giving you money, sometimes you start giving them what they want instead of what's right, I didn't want that dynamic. Margaret looked at him for a long moment. Something shifted in her expression. That's a very thoughtful reason, she said, in the tone of someone slightly surprised. The meeting lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes. By the end of it, the board had voted unanimously for a new oversight structure, approved the engagement of Robert Hadley's forensic firm for a full organizational audit, and authorized Victoria to make all public statements on behalf of the Foundation for the duration of the legal proceedings. They had also, at Garrett's motion, approved a resolution formally acknowledging the Harbor Light Fund's contribution to the Foundation and to the investigation. Ethan asked that the resolution not be made public. Victoria overruled him, gently but completely. The donors who are going to hold this organization together through the next year need to know that the investigation came from inside our own community, she said, not from a regulator or a competitor or someone with a political agenda. It came from someone who cared about the work. That matters. He accepted this because he could see that she was right, even if he didn't particularly like it. He left the building at 11:15 and stood on the sidewalk for a moment in the October sun. His phone had 17 missed calls and approximately 40 text messages. He looked at them without reading them, put the phone in his pocket, and walked to his truck. He drove to the marina. Frank was in the workshop when he arrived, working on the motor yacht's port shaft with a focus that suggested he had been at it for some time and intended to continue. He looked up when Ethan came in. "You're on the news," Frank said. "I figured." "The 11 o'clock. They had a photo." "Which one?" "The one from the Foundation website. Apparently someone found it." Frank set down his tool. "It's a bad photo." "I know. I didn't know they'd taken it." Frank studied him with the look he used when he was deciding whether to say the thing he was actually thinking. "You've been doing this for 6 weeks, Frank said. It wasn't a question. "About that, while also working here." "The boats got fixed." Frank was quiet for a moment. Then, "The Peterson boat is done, by the way. Picked it up this morning." "Thank you." Frank picked up his tool again. "There's coffee in the back." That was all Frank said about it, then or ever. It was, Ethan thought, one of the more perfect responses available, and it was exactly what he needed. He got the coffee. He changed into his work clothes. He spent the rest of the morning on the motor yacht's starboard shaft, which was the worse of the two and required the kind of focused physical attention that left no room in your head for anything else, which was exactly what he needed that particular morning. At 12:30, his phone rang. A number he didn't know, with a 202 area code. He almost didn't answer. He answered. "Mr. Walker, this is Patricia Nguyen from the Washington Post. I'd like to..." "No comment," he said. "Thank you." He hung up. It rang again 4 minutes later. Different number. He turned the ringer off and put the phone in his jacket pocket and went back to the shaft seal. At 2:15, Emily Parker appeared at the end of the dock. He saw her before she saw him. She was standing at the entrance to the marina, looking for him, wearing jeans and a jacket, and carrying a coffee cup from somewhere nearby. She spotted him and walked down the dock toward him, and he straightened up from where he was working and watched her come. She looked different than she had at Lola's. Not better or worse. Different in the way people looked when they'd slept, and the thing they'd been carrying had been set down, even partially. There was less tension in how she moved. "You're all over the news," she said. "So I'm told. They're calling you the anonymous guardian of the Foundation." She said it with a slight wince. That was the actual headline. "That's a terrible headline." "It really is, Mahal." She stopped in front of him. "How are you?" He thought about it. "Fine," he said. Then, because that wasn't complete. "Tired, but fine." She nodded. She looked out at the harbor for a moment, at the light on the water, the boats at their moorings. "I got a call from Sandra Reyes this morning," she said. "They want me to be a cooperating witness. I'm going to testify about the internal records and what I found over those 8 weeks. How do you feel about that?" "Terrified," she said without hesitation. "But also, I don't know. Like it's the right thing. Like if I walked away from it now, I'd be..." She shook her head. "I built that whole file because I couldn't let it go. I can't let go of the testimony either." "You'll be good at it," he said. You don't know that. I know you're organized and accurate, and you don't overstate what you know. That's most of what testimony requires. She looked at him. You're not worried about any of this? The press? The case? Your name being out there? He considered that honestly. I was worried about Lily, he said, that it would change things for her at school, that kids would say things. Has it? I don't know yet. She's only been back one day. He paused. Her teacher called this morning to say that Lily had told her class that her dad found some stolen money, which was her summary of the situation, and that several kids thought that was the coolest thing they'd ever heard. Emily's expression shifted into something that was trying not to be a smile and lost the fight. That's kind of perfect. It's very Lily, he said. The afternoon moved around them. A pelican landed on a nearby piling and regarded them both with the complete indifference of a creature that had no investment in human concerns. Down the dock, one of the other mechanics was working on something that produced occasional metallic sounds and periodic quiet cursing. What happens to the foundation? Emily said. Realistically. Realistically? He leaned against the dock railing. Hard few months. Some donors pull back while they wait to see what the audit finds. Some of the shelters run lean. Victoria has to rebuild the financial management structure from scratch. He paused. But the board is engaged, the core donors are committed, and the legal recovery process for the stolen funds is already underway. Sandra said the bank accounts were frozen before any of the gala money moved, so the immediate theft was stopped. What Richard took over 2 years, that takes longer. But it'll come back. Will the shelters close? Not the real ones. The ones that existed. He looked at the harbor. And they'll build the ones that were supposed to exist. The North Charleston project was already permitted, just never started. That property's still available. Emily was quiet for a moment. I keep thinking about what it would have looked like if we hadn't caught it. If he'd made that transfer and disappeared. She looked at her coffee cup. 240 kids in real shelters, plus however many were supposed to be in the ones that got built with stolen money. All of that just gone. Because one person decided the organization existed to serve him. That's what fraud is, Ethan said. It's not complicated. It's just one person deciding that the thing other people built is theirs to take. She thought about that. And you decided it wasn't. The money was always for the children, he said. It was always only for that. He said it simply, without drama. It was just the fact of the matter. Emily looked at him for a moment with the expression she sometimes had, the one that suggested she was recalibrating something about how people worked, about what was possible inside ordinary life. I need to find a new job, she said. You will. That's optimistic. You built a forensic case that held up to federal scrutiny while employed as a junior accountant, he said. Anyone who looks at what you did will hire you. She made a sound that was somewhere between agreement and anxiety. The testimony is going to be public. People are going to know I was the internal source. Some people will see that as a liability. Most won't. He met her eyes. The people worth working for won't. She stood there for a moment longer. Then she held out her hand. He took it. A handshake, firm, the kind that meant something. Thank you, she said, for trusting me when you had no particular reason to. You called me, he said. That was the reason. She left the way she'd come, back down the dock and up toward the parking lot. He watched her go and thought that she was going to be fine. Not because the path ahead was easy. It wasn't, and she knew it. But because she was the kind of person who did difficult things carefully, and that was enough. The case against Richard Mercer moved through the federal system with the particular grinding efficiency of the legal process when it had strong documentation and a cooperative institutional complainant. Sandra Reyes' team had, in the 10 days between the gala and the formal filing of charges, completed the account trace on all 4 Meridian Capital destination accounts, establishing beyond the standard of evidence required that the accounts were controlled by Richard through a chain of proxy entities that eventually resolved to his personal financial infrastructure. The 2 men Ethan had photographed at the gala, the ones Marcus had flagged from the Meridian LLC filing, were identified as facilitators and offered cooperation agreements in exchange for testimony. Richard Mercer was charged with 12 counts of wire fraud, 4 counts of securities fraud, 2 counts of misappropriation of charitable funds, and 1 count of money laundering. He entered a not guilty plea through his attorney at arraignment, which surprised nobody. What happened 6 weeks after the arraignment surprised somewhat more people, though in retrospect it shouldn't have. His attorney negotiated a plea agreement. Richard Mercer pled guilty to 3 counts, enough to guarantee a significant sentence without the exposure of a full trial. His attorney released a statement saying that his client accepted responsibility and regretted the harm caused. Ethan read the statement on his phone during lunch at the marina and set the phone down and finished his sandwich. He didn't feel what people sometimes expected you to feel at the resolution of something like this. Not triumph. There was nothing triumphant about a man in his 50s deciding, finally, that the pretense was too expensive to maintain. Not satisfaction exactly. Something more like the feeling he got when a repair was complete, the quiet of a system functioning the way it was supposed to function. The sentencing would come later. The asset recovery would take longer. The work of rebuilding would take longer still. The board meeting in the month following the gala produced, among other structural changes, the appointment of an external financial oversight committee. 3 members with no prior relationship to the foundation, with full access to all transaction records, and the authority to flag concerns directly to the board. It produced a revised disbursement approval process that required 3 independent sign-offs on any construction project over $50,000. It produced, after significant discussion, a new policy requiring that all vendor relationships include site verification before funds were released. Victoria drove the reforms with the specific energy of someone who had been angry for a long time and had found a constructive channel for it. She was not, as Ethan had observed in their meeting after the gala, a person who processed things slowly. She processed them completely, and once she was through the processing, she moved. She called him occasionally, not frequently, 3 times in the first month, twice in the second, usually with specific questions. His read on a proposed governance change, whether he thought a particular board candidate had the right background for the oversight committee, once to tell him that the North Charleston property had been formally acquired and construction would begin in the spring. "I want to name it," she said on that particular call. "Name what?" "The shelter. When it's built." A pause. "I was thinking about calling it the Harbor Light Center." He was in his truck in the school parking lot waiting for Lily. "You don't need to do that." "I know I don't need to," she said. "I want to." He thought about it. "Ask me again when it's built," he said. She accepted that. "How's Lily?" "She finished her mural panel, the harbor one." "How did it come out?" "She used too much blue," he said, "but the boats look right." He heard something in Victoria's voice that he was starting to recognize, the specific quality of her when she was amused and trying not to show it because she thought the moment was too small for it. "That sounds about right for an 8-year-old artist." She informed me that the extra blue is intentional. She called it atmospheric. Victoria laughed. A real one, unguarded, the kind that sounded like something releasing rather than something performed. He hadn't heard her laugh before that moment. It changed the frequency of the conversation slightly, opened something in it. "I'm going to the North Charleston site tomorrow morning," she said, when the laugh had settled. "The ground survey. If you wanted to come." He thought about the marina, the boats that needed attention. Frank, who had been covering for him more than usual lately, and who had done so without complaint, which was the Frank Calloway version of profound generosity. "What time?" he said. 8. "I'll be there." He was there. Victoria arrived 2 minutes after he did, in her blue sedan, wearing a jacket and boots appropriate for an unpaved construction site, which told him she'd thought about it before coming. Robert Hadley was there with 2 people from the development firm the foundation had hired. A surveyor, a city permitting official. They walked the property in the October morning light. The scrub grass, the construction barriers still pushed to one side from whenever someone had briefly started something here and then stopped. The field that had appeared in photographs on a USB drive delivered to a woman who needed to see the truth with her own eyes. Victoria stood in the middle of the field and looked at it. Not at the survey maps the development firm people were unrolling, Not at the official documents the permitting person was reviewing. At the field itself. Ethan stood a few feet away. "You know what this should have been?" she said quietly. Not a question. "Yes." "And it will be?" "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. The morning was cold and clear, the kind of day that made the colors sharp. The blue-gray of the sky, the yellow-brown of the dry grass, the rust color of the construction barriers. A crow called from somewhere in the scrubby trees at the field's edge and then went quiet. "I keep thinking about what I missed," she said. "When I go over the last 2 years, the things that should have signaled something was wrong. The times he said something that, looking back," she stopped. "You could do that forever," Ethan said. "I know. It won't change what happened." "I know that too." She looked at the field. "It's just hard to accept that I trusted someone completely and was completely wrong about him." He thought about the right thing to say. He wasn't always sure of this, of what was honest versus what was kind, and whether the two things were the same. "You weren't wrong about him, necessarily," he said. "You were wrong that he was only what he appeared to be. That's a different mistake, harder to guard against." She glanced at him sideways. "Is that supposed to be comforting?" "It's supposed to be accurate." She looked back at the field. "It's a little comforting," she admitted. The survey team was calling her over to review something on the development plan. She went. Ethan stayed where he was for a moment, in the middle of what had been an empty field and was going to be a building. Walls, roof, beds, a kitchen, a common room where children who had nowhere else to go could sit and be somewhere. He thought about the number Emily had given him early in all of this, 240, the specific count of children in shelters the foundation currently operated. He didn't know what the number would be a year from now, after the North Charleston project was complete, after the 3 other shelters whose construction had been funded through fraud were built for real this time. He didn't need to know the number. The number was going to be what it was going to be, based on the work of people who showed up every day and did the work. That was all any number ever was. On a Saturday in November, 4 weeks after the gala, Ethan took Lily to volunteer at one of the foundation's existing shelters in West Ashley. It was the kind of thing he'd done periodically over the years, showing up, doing whatever needed doing without any particular announcement. Today, what needed doing was assembling donated furniture, flat-pack bookshelves and plastic storage units, the kind that came with instructions that were technically accurate but practically cryptic. 3 other volunteers were there, 2 of them college students and 1 a retired contractor named Bill, who had a practiced contempt for any instruction manual he'd ever encountered. Lily, who had apparently inherited some portion of Ethan's mechanical intuition, appointed herself Bill's assistant and spent the morning handing him tools and asking questions he answered with more patience than he extended to most adults. She was also, Ethan noticed, paying attention to the children in the common room, the ones who were residents, the 5 or 6 kids ranging from toddler to approximately her age, who moved through the space with the careful tentativeness of people still learning a new geography. At some point in the late morning, Lily went and sat down next to a girl who looked about 6 and was sitting by herself near the window with a battered picture book. Lily didn't say anything for a moment, just sat there. Then she said something Ethan couldn't hear from across the room, and the girl looked up, and Lily pointed at something in the book, and the girl turned the page to show her, and they looked at it together. He watched that for a moment and then went back to the bookshelf he was working on. Victoria arrived at 11:30. She came in without announcement in jeans and a plain sweater and joined the furniture assembly process without explanation, picking up the instructions for a storage unit and studying them with the focused displeasure of someone who had never assembled flat-pack furniture before and was not going to let that stop her. She ended up at the table next to Ethan's, working on her storage unit with determined imprecision. "Panel B goes on the left," he said, without looking up. "I know where panel B goes." "The bracket is upside down." A pause. "I was testing the bracket." "Sure." She turned the bracket over. They worked in parallel silence for a while, the kind that was companionable rather than empty. Bill made a sound of satisfaction from across the room as the 3rd bookshelf went up. Lily was still at the window with the girl, both of them now on the floor with what appeared to be Lily's drawing notebook, the girl watching while Lily drew something. "She's good with kids," Victoria said quietly. She doesn't really see the category, Ethan said. She just sees people. Victoria looked at Lily for a moment. Her mother's eyes, she said. It was a guess, but it landed correctly. Yeah, he said. They finished the storage unit. It was not perfectly assembled. There was one panel that sat slightly off square, a gap that wouldn't close the way it was supposed to, but it stood, and it was solid, and it would hold what it needed to hold. Ethan looked at it for a moment and decided it was fine. Most things that were built by actual people in actual conditions ended up with a gap or two. That was the reality of construction. You accounted for it and moved on. The lunch that the shelter staff brought out was sandwiches and fruit and juice boxes, the kind of meal designed for both adults and children, and they all ate together at the common room tables, volunteers, staff, and residents, in the pleasant, low-key disorder of a shared meal in a small space. Lily sat between Bill, who was telling her about a house he'd built in 1987 and the ways he'd fixed the mistakes he made along the way, and the 6-year-old girl whose name turned out to be Amara, and who had decided in the span of 2 hours that Lily was her closest ally in the universe. Ethan sat across from Victoria, who was eating half a sandwich and looking at the room with an expression he'd come to recognize. Not the director's assessment she wore at board meetings or the controlled composure of the gala, but something quieter and more real. The look of a person in the actual middle of the thing they'd built, checking whether it was what it was supposed to be. "It's good," he said. She looked at him. "What?" "What you're looking at. It's good." She looked back at the room, the children, the tables, the imperfect bookshelves with their slightly misaligned panels. Bill's voice, telling Lily about concrete foundations. Amara leaning against Lily's shoulder to look at the drawing notebook. "It is," she said, like she needed to hear herself say it. "The parts he didn't touch," Ethan said. "The actual work. That was always real." She nodded slowly. "I needed to be in it to believe that again," she said quietly. "I couldn't feel it from the office." He understood that. He'd always understood that. The reason he came to these places wasn't complicated. You had to be in the thing to know it was real. Documents were documents. Numbers were numbers. The actual reality was always a room, a person, a specific child with a picture book sitting alone near a window. After lunch, when they were cleaning up, Lily came to find him. "Dad," she said, "can Amara come see the boat sometime?" He looked at his daughter, then at Amara, who was standing a few feet behind her, holding the drawing notebook that Lily had apparently given her, watching him with the careful watchfulness of a child who had learned to be careful. "Sure," he said. "If her house parents say it's okay, she can come see the boats." Amara looked at the notebook in her hands, then back up at him. She didn't say anything, but something moved in her face. Not a smile exactly, more the preliminary arrangement of one, the moment before it arrived. Lily nodded like this was settled, which for her it was. They drove home in the late afternoon, the truck windows slightly down despite the November chill, because Lily liked the air and Ethan had stopped arguing about it. She had her drawing notebook open on her lap, or the remaining pages of it, since she'd given a significant portion to Amara, which he'd only found out about on the way to the truck. "You gave her your notebook," he said. "She didn't have one." He watched the road. "That was a good thing to do, Lily Bird." She looked up from the page she was drawing on. The beginning of something, he couldn't tell what yet. "I have another one at home," she said, with the pragmatism of someone for whom the decision had been simple. He thought about that. The casual simplicity of a child who saw someone without something and gave them what she had. No calculation, no weighing of what it cost her, just the obvious thing. Claire would have loved watching that. Loved. Would have said something about it later that evening after Lily was asleep. Something that made the moment larger without making it sentimental. She'd had a gift for that, for finding the right words for things that didn't really need words but benefited from them anyway. He missed her in the particular way he missed her. Not as an absence that pulled at him constantly, but as a presence that came and went, most often at exactly the moments when he thought she would have had something to say. She would have had something to say about all of it. The 6 weeks of late nights, Emily and Marcus and Danny Cho and Sandra Reyes, the gala and Richard Mercer's chin held level on the way out, Victoria in the middle of an empty field, Lily giving her notebook to a girl she'd known for 2 hours. He thought she would have said, "Of course that's how it went." What else would it be? Which was very much how she thought about most things. He pulled into their street and parked in front of the house, and they went inside, and he made dinner. Pasta, the simple kind, the kind Lily would eat without complaint. And they ate it at the kitchen table, and Lily told him that Amara had never been to see a harbor before and that she thought this was important information. "I'll call the shelter Monday," he said. "Work something out." Lily was satisfied with this. She helped clear the table, which was a new development of the past few months. She'd decided she was old enough to do it and had begun doing it without being asked, which was one of the small ongoing revelations of having a child. The ways they grew into themselves when you weren't specifically watching. That evening, after she was asleep, Ethan sat at the kitchen table for the first time in weeks without his laptop open. He just sat there with a cup of coffee that he actually drank while it was hot and looked at the kitchen, the small imperfections of it, the cabinet that didn't close quite right, the light above the stove that buzzed slightly when it was cold, the drawing Lily had done 2 years ago of a boat that was still stuck to the refrigerator with a magnet from a pizza place that had since closed. He thought about the previous 6 weeks and what they had cost and what they had produced. He was not a person who made these assessments naturally. He had a tendency, which he recognized in himself, to move from one thing to the next without sitting with the weight of what he'd done. Claire had pushed back against that sometimes, had said, "You're allowed to let things matter to you before you move on from them." This mattered to him. He let it. The fraud had been stopped. The money, most of it, would come back. The children in the existing shelters were still there, still being served. The field in North Charleston would have a building on it by next fall, if the construction timeline held, which it wouldn't entirely but would approximately. Emily had been hired by a forensic accounting firm in Columbia who had read about the case and reached out before she'd even updated her resume. Marcus had received a thank you bottle of bourbon from Sandra Reyes's office, which he'd reported with the tone of someone genuinely moved by this acknowledgement. Danny Cho had sent Ethan an invoice and a 2-sentence note that said simply, "Good work. Let me know if there's a next time." There didn't need to be a next time. He hoped there wouldn't be. But he noted the possibility without anxiety. He thought about the question he'd been asked, various versions of it, by various people in the weeks since the gala. Victoria had asked it. Margaret from the board had asked it. A journalist from the Charleston Courier had asked it in the voicemail he hadn't returned. Why? Why donate that much money anonymously? Why investigate instead of going to the authorities immediately? Why stay quiet about who you were for 5 years and then walk into a ballroom in a suit that fit adequately and let the room see you? The honest answer was not complicated, but it was hard to say without sounding like something other than what it was. He had the money. The children needed the money. His wife had wanted to help children who needed things. It was 3 facts, and they connected in an obvious way. The investigation. He had found a problem, and he had the capacity to do something about it, and so he had done something about it. That was the whole calculus. The ballroom. Victoria needed him there, and so he was there. The rest of it. The room's judgment, the photograph that had ended up on the news, the fact that people now knew his name, was the cost of the thing, not the reason for it. He had spent a long time constructing a life that asked nothing of the world beyond what was needed. A marina, a house, a truck with a persistent check engine light. Lily, who was his entire understanding of what it meant to build something that mattered. He had not been trying to be invisible. He had just been trying to live in a way that was honest about what he actually was. A man who fixed things, who gave what he could, who tried to be present for his daughter the way his wife would have been present if she'd had the time. He had not been trying to be a story, but stories had a way of finding the people who were doing the actual work, eventually. He'd learned that. He finished his coffee, rinsed the cup, checked the front door, went down the hall, stopped at Lily's doorway, watched her breathe in the slant of hall light for 30 seconds. She had Amara's drawing, the one Amara had done in the notebook before Lily gave it to her, taped to the wall next to her bed. He hadn't noticed it when he'd put her to bed. She must have done it after, in the 5 minutes she always insisted she needed to settle. He couldn't see it clearly in the low light, but it looked like a boat. He went to bed and slept, finally, the way he hadn't slept in 6 weeks. Not easily, because sleeping easily was not particularly in his nature, but deeply. Without the machinery of the case running underneath. without the list of documents and the account traces and the mental map of who knew what and what still needed to be confirmed before the gala. Just sleep. The ordinary, merciful weight of it. In the morning, he took Lily to school and came back to the marina and changed into his work clothes, and Frank had the day's list of repairs already annotated on the clipboard by the workshop door, which was Frank's way of saying everything was normal, and normal was fine, and whatever had happened was handled, and here was what needed doing. He picked up the clipboard, read the list, put on his gloves. The boats needed fixing. There were always boats that needed fixing. You could count on that. The same way you could count on the tide and the particular smell of the harbor in the early morning, and the pelicans on the pilings watching the water with their ancient, unhurried indifference. He got to work. The harbor did what it always did. Moved, changed, caught the light differently, depending on the time of day and the season, and whether the clouds were in or out. It had been doing this since before the city was built around it, and would do it long after, and in between it provided a place for boats and birds, and the ordinary particular labor of people who fixed things that were broken. That was enough. That was the whole of it. Some people built the visible things, the stages, the speeches, the organizations with their names on buildings and their logos on letterhead. Some people built the things underneath, the money in the accounts, the early morning hours at kitchen tables, the careful patient work of holding something together when everything was trying to pull it apart. Neither was more important than the other. Both were necessary. What mattered was that the work was real, that the help was real, that when you looked at the thing you'd built it was actually there, and the people inside it were actually okay. Everything else, the recognition, the headlines, the ballroom full of people now knowing your name, that was just weather. It moved through and left the actual ground unchanged. Ethan Walker, 32 years old, went to work on a Tuesday morning in November, and the harbor was cold and clear, and the boats were where they always were. And somewhere across the city, a field in North Charleston had a survey team's flags in the ground, marking where walls were going to go. The corruption was gone. The children were safe. And the mechanic went back to work, the same as he'd always been. Just a man who fixed what was broken, gave what he had, and asked for very little in return. That was the story. That was all of it.